Beautiful college co-ed, ready to conquer the world.
She was a bright and shining star.
He was a slightly older man who promised to fulfill her every desire.
He was somewhat of a father figure and also a boyfriend.
Their bond seemed to be solid as a rock until a shocking disappearance shattered their picture-perfect romance.
She just disappeared into thin air.
Friends and family launch a desperate search to uncover the truth.
Just let me know where she is.
I wasn't gonna stop until either we found her or found out what happened to her.
The hunt turned into a real sordid chapter.
A chapter that was dripping with jealousy, intrigue, and in the end, an unspeakable evil.
I knew for a fact I was having a meeting with the devil. It sent a chill through me.
This son of a bitch was playing games with the family. He knew what had happened.
This isn't happening. This is not happening.
Wednesday, March 21st, 2007, 5:30 p.m. Investigator Sidney Miller and his partner are driving down a highway north of Houston, Texas. A pair of passengers in the back seat are giving them directions to the possible location of a missing 19-year-old woman who disappeared 6 days prior.
She had actually been missing since March the 15th of 2007.
On the passenger's instructions, the detectives exit the highway and pull into an apartment complex.
He directed us to the back of the complex, to this parking lot, where he pointed out this dumpster.
Fearing the worst, Investigator Miller and his partner peer inside, but the dumpster is empty.
Sure this is it?
There was no obvious human remains that I could see at that point.
Was this some kind of sick joke, or another dead end in an ever more troubling case?
We didn't know where she was. At that point, we didn't know what happened to her.
To unlock the mystery of this missing woman, detectives will follow a twisted path of lust and betrayal, lovers and lies, all of which leads to a young woman whose bright future was snuffed out in the darkest way imaginable. Early on, Tynesha Stewart's family knew there was something special about her.
My family just knew that Tanisha was gonna stand out and accomplish so much.
But Tynesha was no stranger to hard times. One of 6 children, Tynesha grew up in one of Houston's toughest neighborhoods and lost her father at a very young age. Still, Tynesha refused to let her environment dictate her future.
She was really good in school. She really studied her books. She took that very serious.
Blessed with natural beauty and an infectious smile, Tynesha had no problem attracting boys.
Tynesha always had multiple guys wanting to date her.
But Tynesha wanted more from love than what the average guy could offer.
Tanisha was more attracted to someone that could challenge her.
In May 2005, while working at a pizza restaurant, the stunning 17-year-old met a man that fit the bill. Handsome coworker Tim Shepard.
So what's up? We still on for this weekend?
I don't know.
You don't know.
Yeah.
You promised.
I gotta study.
Oh, you gonna act funny now?
Tim would keep asking her to go out on dates. Eventually, she just gave in and said, okay, I'll try it.
We're gonna do a little dancing. It's gonna be a good time.
Okay. It went from them just being friends or co-workers to them actually developing an intimate relationship with each other.
Bye. That's my favorite part.
Yeah, it's gonna become my favorite show.
Although Tim was 25, neither he nor Tynesha let their 8-year age gap stand in the way of their budding romance.
Tim and Tynesha's relationship progressed pretty swiftly. It just became really serious.
I'm so happy.
Yeah, because I'm here.
Yes, because you're here.
But just as this steamy relationship reached a boiling point, Tynesha's family turned down the heat.
So a phone call is more important than me?
Hey, Mom. Yeah, it's Tim. Don't do that. Mom, don't do that. Like, come on, really?
We want to know what his motives were. He could have picked any other woman that was his age to date. Why is he dating such a young girl?
I don't know.
It'd be fine, look. Just do a little in-house visit. I'll smooth everything out.
Really?
Yeah. Head in the wrong place, I think.
So it's something simple.
I think you just gotta plug this plug in. Yeah.
In order to prove how much he loved Tynesha, Tim began spending time with her family. It didn't take long for Tim to win them over.
There you have it.
Yes! Thank you
Oh, no problem. You're welcome.
He was always around at my mom's house, trying to fix their TV, trying to fix their computers.
Going right for the table.
You know, I try to do what I can.
Thank you, Tim.
Oh, you're welcome.
They embraced him as another son. Her mom embraced him. Her sister, her brother embraced him as like another brother.
But just when it seemed like the young couple couldn't get any closer, some good news took Tanisha's life in a different direction.
Tanisha earned a scholarship to Texas A&M University.
I was so happy for her. It was a big accomplishment.
Even though the A&M campus is nearly 2 hours from Tanisha's home in Houston, Tanisha was determined to keep her relationship with Tim alive. But just 3 months into her first semester in college, Tim reignited a relationship with an old girlfriend and subsequently dumped Tanisha.
I remember Tanisha just bawling, crying, stating that she couldn't believe that her and Tim had broken up.
But no sooner had Tim broken up with Tanisha than he realized he'd made a terrible mistake.
He decided to go down to Texas A&M and surprise her, and from there they were able to talk and discuss whatever issues they were having, and from there they started back dating.
But this time around, something seemed different.
They just weren't seeing eye to eye, and Tanisha was on a different level. She became even more independent.
She was meeting new people and trying new things out on her own. Tanisha's goal was to move forward in life.
When Tanisha returned home for spring break, she saw Tim briefly, but spent most of her time hanging out with friends.
Who's going to the concert with?
They're my girlfriends.
Okay. I'm gonna see you afterwards.
Well, we're trying to go eat afterward.
So I have to set up appointments to see my girlfriend now?
No, it's not like that.
I heard Tanisha was coming home for spring break, and I briefly talked to her. She told me that her and a couple of her friends were going to see Beyonce in concert.
But a few days before the concert, Tanisha's sister Gayla had a nightmare.
I had a bad dream that some jealous girls jumped on her and beat her, and we couldn't find her body. Tanisha was like, "Oh, calm down. I promise you that I'm gonna be okay."
Sadly, Gayla's nightmare would hit closer to home than anyone in Tanisha's family could have ever imagined. Sunday, March 18th, 2007. As Gayla returns home from church, she receives a disturbing phone call from her mother.
Hello?
Gayla?
Hey,
Have you
Mom.
talked to Tanisha?
No, not since Thursday. Why?
Oh my goodness, nobody's heard from her.
What do you mean nobody's heard from her?
She was supposed to go to the Beyonce concert. I knew that. And then she
Right.
didn't show up.
She never made it to the concert?
No.
Oh my God, Mom.
My heart had dropped because I knew and I felt it in my spirit, in my soul, that something was wrong.
Tanisha's friends echo those sentiments. 36 hours pass, and there's still no sign of Tanisha.
I'm terrified because I don't know what's going on at all. It does not make sense to me.
Why is this going on? Why is this happening?
Police would soon be asking the same questions. But nobody could anticipate the horrific answers they would uncover, or what hidden desires burned in the heart of a missing young woman. For 2 years, Tim Shepard and Tanisha Stewart had a love that knew no bounds.
When she finally decided to start dating him, she cut off, anybody else at the time.
However, when Tanisha moved away to college in the fall of 2006, her and Tim's once unbreakable bond began showing a few cracks.
It was on and off, but she still would come back and visit with Tim. And I believe Tanisha was still in love with him.
But in March 2007, their world turns upside down when Tanisha returns home for spring break and inexplicably disappears. Several days pass, and there's still no sign of Tanisha.
We went around to some hospitals. We even called the jail, just trying to cover all bases, and no one had heard from her.
Gayla Taylor also reaches out to her sister's boyfriend, Tim Shepard. But like everyone else, Tim has no clue what happened to Tanisha.
Hello?
Tim, hey, this is Gayla.
Hey, what's up?
What's going on? Mom just called me saying that Tanisha's missing.
What? Hold on. Missing? What do you mean missing?
Yeah, she's missing. She's not answering her phone. I mean, when is the last time you talked to her?
According to Tim, the last he spoke with Tanisha was 3 days prior, on Thursday morning.
It was like she came over to the house with me, but she left, and that was the last time I heard her or seen her.
Nobody's talked to her since then?
No, it's not like Tanisha to just leave and not answer her phone and not call anybody and not check in.
Fearing the worst, Tanisha's family files a missing persons report Monday, March 19th. Once investigators realized Tim was one of the last people to see Tanisha, they asked him to come down to the station.
So, Mr. Shepard, can you tell me the last time you talked to Tanisha?
A couple of days ago, Thursday.
His story was that he picked Tanisha up that Thursday morning around 3 o'clock in the morning.
So you was driving back to your apartment Thursday. Did y'all talk about anything?
Tried to. She got a phone call from, some guy.
The caller was Tanisha's college friend, Mark Marks, who she'd hung out with earlier that night.
This upset Timothy. When they get back to the apartment, Timothy confronts Tanisha about why is he calling you so early in the morning. And Tanisha says, I don't want to talk about it, and we can talk about it when we wake up.
I mean, we've kind of having relationship problems, so I was just trying to smooth things out and got to the apartment. She just went in the room. She didn't want to mention anything about it. So I kind of suspected she was cheating on me a little.
Tim tells investigators that despite his misgivings, he agreed to table the issue as Tanisha requested. But when they woke up a few hours later, Tim confronted Tanisha about the phone call with Mark Marks. Again, she stonewalled him.
Ty, we need to talk about this.
Talk about what?
About what? This whole situation.
What whole situation? There's nothing to talk about.
Once they get up, he confronts her about why Mr. Marks called her so early in the morning. Tanisha says, I don't want to talk about it. I'm tired of talking about it.
There's nothing to talk about?
No, it's not.
Okay, what about Mark then?
We're not talking about Mark. I'm not talking
Okay,
this.
well...
Really? I came home to have fun. I'm not doing this.
Are you serious?
Bye.
According to Tim, Tanisha then stormed out of his apartment.
She left the apartment and left walking on her own that day. And that was the last time he says that he saw her.
Tim, are you being honest with us?
Yes, I'm being honest.
And you don't have any idea where she is?
I have no idea. I love Tanisha.
They questioned him for, I think they said 20 hours, something like that.
While Tim never wavers from his account, police are curious if his apartment might tell another story.
When Shepard gave his statement, he also gave us written consent, voluntary consent to search his apartment.
But a search of Tim's apartment fails to turn up any evidence related to Tanisha's disappearance.
We didn't have any strong suspicion that he had done anything illegal, so we gave him the key back to his apartment and we continued our investigation.
With Tim all but eliminated as a suspect, detectives set their sights on another man, Mark Marks.
He was one of the last two people to be around Tanisha. So quite naturally, Mark Marks was a person that law enforcement wanted to speak with.
Had Tanisha been seeing Mark Marks on the side? If so, could Mark be involved in Tanisha's disappearance? Hoping to answer these questions, detectives reach out to one of Tanisha's closest friends, Ashley Walton, and make a shocking discovery.
I want to thank you for coming down here, taking your time out of your busy schedule to talk with us.
Of course.
Just got a few questions to ask you.
Yeah.
Ever heard of a Mark Marks?
Of course I have. I mean, I set him and Tanisha up. He's a friend of my boyfriend. Him and Tanisha were together for maybe a month or so. They're crazy about each other.
They hit it off. But at the time, Tanisha was still dating Timothy.
Now, let me ask you this. Did Mark know about Tim?
Yes, he did. He didn't really like the fact that he had shared Tanisha with anybody. I mean, who would like that kind of idea?
Well, then why didn't she break it off with Tim?
I mean, it's hard, when you love someone, because she did love Tim.
Like I said, I appreciate you coming down here and talking with us.
The interview with Ashley is a revelation, and police can't help but wonder, could Tanisha's ongoing relationship with Tim have triggered some sort of jealous rage in boyfriend number 2, Mark Marks? Determined to unravel this mystery, detectives track Mark Marks down and bring him in for questioning on Wednesday, March 21st.
What's the nature of your relationship with Tanisha?
Or dating?
Mark was a typical 19-year-old kid. I mean, couple of tattoos, sharp, articulate. He was cooperative.
Did you know she was dating Tim Shepard as well?
Yeah, sure, she told me.
So how did that make you feel?
Well, I didn't like it.
Yeah, I bet you did.
Turning up the heat, detectives press Mark for answers.
So when was the last time you saw her?
It was last Thursday.
He indicated that he had last seen her earlier Thursday. She was at some other friend's house at the time, but he had left her at the apartment.
What time was that?
I don't know, like 3 a.m.?
Did you talk about your relationship that evening?
Yeah, sure, we talked about a lot. I mean, she told me that she was ready to leave Tim, that she and I were gonna be together. She didn't want to hurt his feelings, but that she was ready to move on.
Detectives are suspicious. Mark's statement places him with Tynesha shortly before Tim picked her up. Is it possible seeing Tynesha with Tim sent Mark into a jealous rage, and that Mark waited until she left Tim's apartment a few hours later to exact his revenge?
Did you have anything to do with her disappearance?
No, not at all.
Did you pick her up from Tim's apartment?
Absolutely not.
Mark Marks is adamant he had nothing to do with Tynesha's disappearance. He also claims to have a rock-solid alibi. He was at a party with friends on nearby South Padre Island at the time Tynesha vanished.
So you have no idea what happened to her?
No, not at all. I love Tanisha. She was all I cared about. I would never do anything to hurt her.
Detectives confirm Mark's alibi and let him go.
He was as innocent as they come. It showed that it really shook him when he learned that Tynesha was missing.
With their top two suspects in the clear, detectives begin looking elsewhere. That's when a frightening theory surfaces. The possibility that Tynesha might have been abducted by a stranger after leaving Tim Shepard's apartment on foot.
We had to broaden our picture and start looking at all the other angles or possibilities that she could have come up missing.
1 week into the investigation, fear continues to mount, and with each passing day, the chances of finding Tynesha become slimmer and slimmer.
The first 24 to 48 hours are the most crucial time when someone is kidnapped or comes up missing. And after that 48-hour period, they're either dead or gone.
But as detectives dig deeper into Tynesha's case, they uncover a series of shocking yet seemingly unrelated clues. The question is, can they connect the dots before it's too late? Ever since 19-year-old Tynesha Stewart started college, her romance with boyfriend Tim Shepard had been a bit of a roller coaster ride.
They did love each other, but it was not a smooth relationship.
Tim hoped to work out the kinks in the relationship when Tynesha returned home over spring break. But shortly after arriving, Tynesha vanished without a trace.
Nothing was making sense because we couldn't find her.
Although investigators have put both Tim and Tynesha's new love interest, Mark Marks, through intense interrogations, they're still no closer to finding her. And now they're faced with a far more chilling prospect, that Tynesha may have been abducted by a stranger after leaving Tim's apartment on foot.
We were looking at the whole picture, whether somebody picked her up in a car and took her off, or somebody, grabbed inside one of the apartments.
Police combed the area surrounding the apartments where Tim lives.
He lived in the back of his apartments, and his apartment was down a dark road full of trees and woods.
While officers are searching the area for clues, back at headquarters, a tip rolls in. A woman who lives in the area recalls hearing something very suspicious around the time Tynesha disappeared.
Dispatch, do you have a K-9 unit in service? Okay, have them meet us at 675 Cumberland. We're on the way. I just talked to a neighbor. She heard gunshots coming from the wood lines the night of Tanisha's disappearance. Said that she heard the car speed off. I got K-9 units on the way.
When the K-9 unit arrives, they immediately notice the faint smell of death in the air.
Smell that? Yeah, let's go see what we can find.
All right, let's go.
Inside my head, I just knew that somewhere around there we were gonna find her body.
Locking onto the scent, the K-9 officer leads investigators deeper into the woods. Minutes later, they finally locate the source of the smell.
What you got, bud?
The rotting remains of a dead animal.
That's not what we're looking for.
Yeah, not a bad thing, though.
All right.
While friends and family breathe a sigh of relief, the clock is ticking. Tynesha's sister Gayla decides it's time to join detectives in the search.
I started calling family, friends, getting my own search party together. They came the next day with a whole bunch of more volunteers.
We knocking on doors, talking to neighbors that may have seen or heard something, that may have seen her walking away.
Despite the additional boots on the ground, nobody recalls seeing Tynesha. But several residents make the same curious observation, that Tim Shepard spent the day after Tanisha's disappearance doing some serious barbecuing.
He had 2 grills going at one point, and they were concerned Timothy was going to burn the place down.
Worried neighbors said they dialed 911 once the smoke got out of control. After police and firemen contained the fire, they turned their attention toward Tim.
What's all the smoke here from today?
I was doing some last-minute grilling.
Tim told first responders he was cooking the main course for an upcoming church picnic.
How much meat you cooking?
It's for about 150, 200 people. Just throwing meat on the grill, I got a little bit behind, so it's just kind of got chaos.
Just kind of flamed up?
Yeah.
This is a lot of smoke.
It is, man. I had a lot of food.
The building's on fire.
Tim's story is confirmed when firemen looked around his apartment.
One of the firemen reported seeing what he thought was ribs in a bathtub that was filled with water, meat.
To detectives, it seems odd that Tim would be more interested in grilling out than helping look for his girlfriend.
If he really loved her, why is he not searching for her?
As detectives ponder that very question, they receive another bizarre report about Tim.
I myself talked to one particular individual who noticed him pouring bleach on his patio, and she said it was so strong that it was burning her eyes.
Was Tim just trying to clean up after his grill session got a bit out of hand? Or was he trying to hide something else?
That led law enforcement to look at him as a potential suspect.
When detectives shine the light of suspicion on Tim, they find something dark lurking just under the surface. But they'll also soon discover it is another man, not Tim, who holds the key to unlocking the mystery behind Tynesha Stewart's disappearance. It's been a week since 19-year-old college freshman Tynesha Stewart vanished without a trace. Although police initially ruled out her longtime boyfriend Tim Shepard as a suspect, recent reports of suspicious behavior have police circling back to him.
Tenants reported Shepard barbecuing for a period of from Friday all the way over the weekend, continuously.
Perhaps more importantly, neighbors also reported seeing Tim cleaning his patio with an inordinate amount of bleach shortly after Tanisha's disappearance. Could Tim be trying to cover something up? If so, what? Hoping to learn more about Tim and Tanisha's history, detectives reach back out to her friends and family. While no one denies Tim loved Tynesha, they say that the more Tynesha spread her wings at college, the more possessive and domineering Tim became.
He felt like he pretty much owned her.
He would call, harass her, and at times even drove down to Texas A&M, walking the campus trying to find her when she wouldn't return his phone calls.
But despite Tim's increasingly controlling nature, he still held a special place in Tynesha's heart.
She just longed for Timothy to love her, without abuse, without control, without violence.
But when Tim learned about Tanisha's blossoming relationship with college friend Mark Marks, the situation went from bad to worse.
There were some threats that Timothy had made to Tanisha via, cell phone, text messages.
But the threatening messages were just the beginning.
Kayla told us about a time when Tim didn't want her to leave and that Tim had strangled her.
Threatening messages, physical violence, when coupled with the fact that Tim scoured his patio with bleach shortly after Tanisha's disappearance. Investigators are now wondering if perhaps Tim is behind Tanisha's disappearance after all.
There were some clues there. There was evidence of recent cleaning going on in that apartment. But we didn't have enough at that point to charge him with anything.
Investigators may not have enough evidence to charge Tim Shepard, but Tanisha's family is now convinced he's somehow involved.
I was like, this guy's gonna get away with this if I don't get these people to arrest him. And that's when I decided to call Quanell X.
He is somewhat of an activist for the African American community.
I've been the one that black men in this city have come to when they're wanted by police. And I've been able to, by God's grace, facilitate many peaceful surrenders.
In a face-to-face meeting with Quanell X, Tanisha's sister desperately pleads her family's case.
The reason I'm here to talk to you is my sister, Tanisha Stewart, has been missing.
Tanisha Stewart? And when's the last time you seen her?
They were adamant that they knew something had happened to her, and they were extremely terrified and worried of where was their loved one.
Her boyfriend, Tim, is the last one to see her.
Tim Shepard?
Yes, that's him.
Turns out Quanell is already familiar with Tanisha's disappearance. Tim Shepard's family had also called on him to help.
And they were asking me to get involved to help protect him from overzealous cops that were going to pin a dirty charge on him. His family's saying he didn't do anything.
Unsure who to believe, Quanell X calls Tim Shepard, who agrees to a private meeting at his apartment.
Tim?
Yeah.
Hey, I'm Quanell.
Hey, how you doing, man?
Hey, brother. How you doing?
I'm freaking out, man.
When Quanell arrives, Tim is upset.
I'm saying, brother, it's going to be okay. It's going to be all right, Tim. And he was extremely stressed.
Is there any place that we can talk?
Just talking in the bathroom. I feel like they have my place wired or something.
Okay, let's go to that.
Okay.
He said he's trying to set me up. And I said, Tim, if you're innocent, I'll fight for you, brother. But if you're not innocent, brother, we need to talk about this.
Tim nervously recalls the last time he saw Tanisha.
We had a fight and she stormed out. That was the last time I saw her. I swear.
I said, brother, look me in my eye. And he put his head down like that. And then I knew there was more to the story than what he was saying. I said, Tim, look me in my eye. Tim, did you do something to this girl? And at that moment, everything changed. Everything.
In the case of missing college freshman Tanisha Stewart, some peculiar behavior, along with a series of eyewitness statements, have catapulted Tanisha's boyfriend, Tim Shepard, to the top of the suspect list. But without any physical evidence connecting Tim to any crime, bringing charges against him will be impossible. In desperation, Tanisha's family has turned to a well-known community activist named Quanell X for help. And in an emotional face-to-face meeting with Tim, Quanell seems to be on the verge of a breakthrough.
He said to me, they're gonna give me the death penalty. And I said, Tim, why would they give you the death penalty, man?
Is she dead? Yeah.
Tim tells Quanell that when Tanisha refused to elaborate on her relationship with Mark Marks, he flew into a jealous rage.
She was messing with this guy named Mark, and...
Did y'all get into a fight?
Yeah.
And what happened?
I just went into a rage, and I killed her.
Tim tells Quanell that as Tanisha was walking out the door, he attacked her and ultimately strangled her to death.
And what'd you do with her after that?
Put her body in a dumpster.
My heart was racing. Because now I've gone from trying to help this brother, possibly who's being set up by overzealous investigators, to a man who has now committed a cold-blooded killing.
After hearing Tim's confession, Quanell X relays the statement to investigator Sidney Miller. The two men, along with Miller's partner and a distraught Tim Shepard, then head to a dumpster where Tim allegedly disposed of Tanisha's body.
We're going to be able to give this family some closure and find out what actually happened.
Believing Tanisha's body is inside the trash bin, investigator Miller calls in a CSI team. But no sooner have they started putting up the yellow tape than Tanisha's family pulls up.
He just kept saying, is she alive? Is she alive? And I said, no. I said, she's not alive. And they all just broke down in hysterics.
I mean, it's like my heart was ripped out of my chest.
But while Tanisha's family mourns their apparent loss, CSIs make a shocking discovery. Tanisha's body isn't in the dumpster, nor for that matter is anything else.
I noticed that the dumpster, it looked like it had been recently emptied.
So now where did the dumpster go? Well, there's a landfill. It's massive.
Detectives know that in a city the size of Houston, the chances of finding Tanisha's body in a landfill are slim to none.
You have not a needle in a haystack, but you've got a needle in a stack of haystacks.
After learning that a search of the landfill would cost upwards of $500,000, a tough decision is made.
Tanisha's family talked to the sheriff and said, don't waste the money.
Making matters even more difficult is the fact that shortly after his arrest, Tim Shepard has a change of heart about his confession.
He had invoked his right to have an attorney, and at that point he didn't want to talk. But based on the information we already had, at that point, we had enough to charge him.
But with Tim's prior confession without Tanisha's body, it will be difficult to make the murder charges stick. Investigators must find more evidence in order to solidify their case. Again, they turn to the CSI team to scour Tim's apartment for additional clues.
We knew that we would be looking for microscopic evidence, so we just made sure we wouldn't leave a stone unturned.
The search pays off.
We found some bone fragments in the garbage disposal, eventually found what we later learned was enamel.
Officer Hunter, found this next to the grill.
Did you get a photograph of it?
I did.
Let's back that.
CSIs also find some charred bone fragments not far from where Tim kept his grill. The bone fragments are sent to the crime lab. While the charred remains are in too poor a condition to be positively ID'd, the enamel found in the disposal is determined to be from one of Tanisha's teeth.
I think your teeth don't go down a garbage disposal unless someone puts them down there.
Between this new evidence, the accounts of Tim's nonstop barbecuing, and reports from a fireman who saw what he thought was uncooked meat floating in Tim's bathtub, a new, more horrific picture of the crime begins to emerge.
They believe that Tanisha, she had been chopped up and incinerated.
Armed with this gruesome information, a grand jury officially indicts Tim Shepard for the murder of Tanisha Stewart. But as the case heads to trial, prosecutors know they still face an uphill battle.
That was probably the biggest hurdle, to get the jury to convict just based on the circumstantial evidence alone.
On September 29, 2008, the state of Texas versus Tim Shepard gets underway.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Tim Shepard is responsible for the death of Tanisha Stewart.
I felt a lot of pressure just because I didn't want to let Tanisha's family down, and I didn't want to let Tanisha down.
Prosecutors open by laying out the state's version of the crime. In the morning hours of March 15, 2007, Tim Shepard murdered Tanisha in his Houston apartment. To cover up the crime, Tim hacked Tanisha's body into pieces, then spent days cooking her remains over a grill before tossing them in the dumpster to cover his tracks.
There was sufficient evidence for us to put it before a jury and let them make the determination that she was in fact killed and mutilated in a gruesome manner.
As for a motive, prosecutors claim Tim would have rather seen Tanisha dead than to see her with another man.
She disrespected him because she began to move on with her life.
Tim's defense team counters that the state's theory is just that, a theory.
Regardless of what the prosecution tells you, there is no evidence.
In this case, there is no body. We felt like without a body, this would be a hurdle for the prosecution.
Even so, there was no denying the tooth fragments found inside Tim's disposal did come from Tanisha.
No person that was alive is going to quietly allow someone to extract a tooth or teeth from them and put them in a garbage disposal.
After putting forth physical evidence, prosecutors called their star witness to the stand, Quanell X.
Quanell testified where Timothy identified locations where he tossed her body after he mutilated her, and that was gripping testimony.
I asked him if he killed her, and he said yes.
Quanell's testimony is riveting, but some in the courtroom question his credibility.
He's a controversial character. He has done time for selling drugs. He has now made a name for himself for standing up for minority rights in the city.
With Quanell X's turn on the witness stand seemingly a push, prosecutors play their last card and call the defendant's own cousin, Nicholas Shepard, to the stand. What Nicholas has to say blows everyone in the courtroom away.
Nicholas testified to the fact that Timothy said he would do harm to Tanisha if it came down to it, and that if he had to kill somebody, he would cut them up and boil them.
I think the jury was a little bit surprised about what they were hearing. You could sense some shock and disbelief.
But before the final gavel falls, The defense will call a surprise witness to the stand. A witness whose story could crush the prosecution's case. A witness named Tim. Prosecutors claim that 29-year-old Tim Shepard killed his beautiful young girlfriend, Tynesha Stewart, in order to prevent her from seeing another man. Then Tim gruesomely dismembered, burned, and disposed of Tynesha's remains. Tim's attorneys counter that since police never recovered Tynesha's body, there's no proof a murder was ever committed.
How do we know she's even dead?
But Tim's own cousin, Nicholas Shepard, testifies that Tim confessed he would do just that if Tynesha ever tried to leave him.
He said if she ever left from me, he would cut her up, boil her.
The testimony of Nicholas Shepard seems to seal the deal. After 24 hours of deliberation, the jury returns with their verdict.
The jury came back with a guilty verdict of murder, and I was happy for Tynesha's mother and her family and her friends.
I was relieved because I felt like that was finally the end of the emotional roller coaster that we had all experienced within the past year.
But even with the guilty verdict, this roller coaster trial is far from over. In Texas, the official verdict can't be handed down until after the sentencing hearing, and can even be overturned during that phase of the process. And at his sentencing hearing, Tim Shepard makes a bold move and takes the stand in his own defense. Under oath, Tim claims that on the night of the crime, Tynesha was the one who was hungry for blood, and that Tim had killed her purely in self-defense.
Tim tried to make her look like she was a participant in her own death. If she wouldn't have did what she did, then maybe he wouldn't have did what he did.
Tim tells the jury that it started when he confronted Tynesha about her relationship with Mark Marks.
For a long time, I've been suspected she's been cheating on me. I asked her about this guy named Mark.
Sit down, let's just talk about
There's
it.
nothing to talk
It's
about.
a lot to talk about. What about this? Who's this Mark guy? Who is Mark?
No, Mark doesn't matter. Move.
He said that he was blocking the door so that she wouldn't leave because he wanted to work things out.
According to Tim, that's when Tynesha snapped.
She just flipped out.
He says that Tynesha grabbed some knife that was laying on a coffee table and slashed at him.
What are you doing?
Move.
Put it down.
And he grabbed her neck to keep her from stabbing or slashing at him anymore.
He said there was a brief struggle and that he blacked out. And that's all he remembers until he woke up and she wasn't breathing.
To support Tim's testimony, his attorneys submit photographs taken of Tim's hands the night he was arrested. Photographs that suggest Tim had recently been cut by some sort of sharp object.
Tim really believed that he was defending himself and that it was an accident.
It's compelling evidence. And if the jury believes Tim's version of events, it's possible that he will spend little to no time in prison.
It just felt like a nightmare. I just couldn't believe that this was unspiraling the way that it was.
But the scales of justice tipped back in prosecutors' favor when they asked him to explain his ghastly behavior in the wake of Tynesha's death.
We talked about what he did with the parts of her body, and I asked if he put them on the barbecue pit, and he very quickly corrected me and said, no, I put her in the smoker.
To me, that's not human.
On the heels of this gruesome testimony, not only does the jury uphold the guilty verdict, but they hammer Tim with the maximum sentence possible.
Assess his punishment at confinement in the Institutional Division of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice for 99 years.
They knew that a man that was capable of such a cold-blooded murder and could talk about it in such a way was dangerous and could never be trusted.
But in the minds of Tynesha's friends and family, the punishment doesn't go far enough.
I prefer...
The silence of 40 years was not a peaceful one. It was a pressurized chamber, a vacuum waiting for a single pinprick to shatter the facade of a quiet town. It was 1986, the year the world turned cold for the Miller family, a year swallowed by the mist of an Oregon autumn, where the investigation began not with a bang, but with the haunting absence of a 9-year-old girl. You look at the crime scene photos. They are grainy, sepia-toned ghosts, and you see the bicycle lying on its side, a wheel still spinning in the static of your mind, the handlebars cold, the chain unhooked, a snapshot of a life interrupted in the heartbeat between a pedal stroke and a scream. The town of Oakhaven didn't just lose a child, it lost its innocence, and the subsequent weeks became a blur of frantic searches, heavy boots trampling through damp underbrush, and the rhythmic, hollow thud of helicopters slicing through the gray canopy. The police report, now brittle with age, speaks of no forced entry, no fingerprints, and no witnesses, a trifecta of professional paralysis that turned a missing persons case into a terminal void. Every neighbor became a suspect, every shadow in the rearview mirror a phantom of the perpetrator, and as the months hardened into years, the investigation shifted from active pursuit to a stagnant file gathering dust in the basement of the precinct, a tomb for the truth. But the story didn't end in the archives. It festered there because in the world of cold cases, silence is merely a temporary condition. For 4 decades, the community lived in the shadow of the unknown, a collective trauma that shaped the architecture of their lives, turning unlocked doors into fortresses and strangers into threats. We're talking about the kind of case that keeps detectives awake at 3 a.m., the ones where the evidence is too thin to hold a conviction, but too visceral to forget. You can feel the weight of it in the air, that heavy, electric tension that clings to the skin like humidity before a storm. Then, the miracle, or the nightmare, began in a sterile lab, with a new generation of investigators deploying a DNA sweep that felt more like an autopsy of the past than a forensic process. They re-examined the discarded sweater, the fibers under the fingernails, the microscopic trace of a killer who thought he had outrun his own biology. As the data started to populate the screen, a name emerged from the darkness, a name no one had whispered, a name that was buried in the very history they were trying to excavate. The shockwaves were immediate and visceral. The arrest didn't just solve a case, it ripped open the bandages of a town that had spent 40 years pretending the wound wasn't still bleeding. The man they dragged out of his suburban home didn't look like a monster. He looked like a grandfather, a neighbor, a man who had blended into the wallpaper of reality for half a century. And that is the true terror of the cold case, the realization that the predator was sitting at the dinner table while the town searched the woods. We're standing on the precipice of a revelation that threatens to dismantle everything we thought we knew about the night in 1986. Every lead, every dead end, every year of uncertainty was building toward this singular moment of accountability, and as the handcuffs clicked into place, the sound echoed through the hollow spaces of 40 years of grief. We are now forced to confront the chilling intimacy of the crime, the fact that the killer didn't come from the shadows. He came from the community. As we peel back the layers of this narrative, you will see how the smallest, most overlooked thread of evidence can unravel the most meticulously constructed lie, and why some secrets are never truly buried. They are only waiting for the right moment to rise from the grave and demand their day in court. The evidence sat in a climate-controlled evidence locker for 10,000 days, a silent, mocking witness to a tragedy that the rest of the world had long since archived. When the lead investigator, Detective Miller, a man whose face was a topographic map of stress and sleepless nights, decided to pull that box back out, it wasn't because he had a sudden spark of genius. It was because the forensic technology had finally caught up to the nightmares. In 1986, the science of genetic identification was in its infancy, a primitive tool that required vast samples and months of manual processing. Today, we exist in the age of forensic genetic genealogy, where a single degraded molecule of skin cell can act as a beacon in the night, cutting through decades of obstruction to reveal a lineage that stretches across continents and generations. This wasn't just about a rerun of old tests, it was a total reconstruction of the crime scene through a high-definition lens, a digital autopsy that allowed the team to see things the detectives of the 80s literally could not perceive. They started with the sweater. It had been recovered 3 miles from the point of disappearance, snagged on the jagged edge of a rusted barbed wire fence, stained by the damp, acidic soil of the Oregon timberland. For 38 years, it had been a dead end. Every thread had been picked over, every stain tested for ABO blood types that offered nothing but a statistical shrug. But in the modern lab, the sweater became a gold mine. The team used vacuum suction forensics to harvest microscopic skin cells trapped in the weave, particles of biological material so faint they would have been invisible to the human eye, yet they carried the absolute truth of the killer's existence. When the DNA was extracted, it wasn't a match in a traditional criminal database. The perpetrator hadn't committed a felony since, leaving his genetic footprint absent from the Cody system, but the science didn't stop there. They uploaded the profile to a public genetic genealogy site, a vast, open-source library of ancestral history, looking for distant cousins, second, third, and fourth-degree matches. The screen in the laboratory hummed with a steady, rhythmic pulse of data processing. For 72 hours, the team didn't sleep. They watched as the algorithms combed through millions of records, filtering through the complex web of human ancestry to triangulate a biological identity. Each match was a breadcrumb, a small piece of a puzzle that had been scattered for nearly half a century. They found a cousin in Kansas, a distant relative in London, and a biological grandfather who had immigrated from Europe in the early 1900s. It was a digital tapestry, a map of lives that had intersected in the most unexpected ways, leading them closer and closer to the singular truth hidden in the genetic code. The tension in the room was suffocating. It was the feeling of a net finally tightening around a target that had never realized it was being hunted. Every time the software generated a new list of leads, the investigators felt the phantom presence of the victim, a child whose voice had been silenced, now reaching out through the cold, unyielding precision of science to name the man who had stolen her future. Then, at 4:14 a.m. on a Tuesday, the breakthrough. The match wasn't just a statistical probability. It was a firm alignment of genetic markers that pointed directly to a singular family tree. Detective Miller stood over the technician's shoulder, his breath hitching in his throat as the software mapped out the remaining suspects. There were 3 brothers who fit the age profile, 3 men who had been in the vicinity of Oakhaven in the fall of 1986. But only one of them had a history that was suspiciously thin, a man who had moved across state lines just weeks after the disappearance, a man who had intentionally avoided any paper trail that could connect him to his past. He had lived a life of deliberate invisibility, a shadow walking among the living, believing that the passage of time was his ultimate exoneration. He didn't know that every breath he took, every cell he shed, and every piece of DNA he left behind was a permanent record of his actions, a ticking clock that would eventually catch up to him. The detectives began the agonizing process of tactical surveillance. They didn't rush in. They couldn't afford to. They sat in unmarked sedans, watching the suspect walk to his mailbox, watching him buy groceries, watching him engage in the mundane, boring, and utterly terrifying rituals of a man who thought he was free. He looked so ordinary, so unremarkable, that it felt like a betrayal of the horror he had inflicted. How could a monster be so mundane? That was the question that fueled the fatigue-racked eyes of the surveillance team. They followed him to his workplace, a local warehouse where he was known as a quiet, hard-working man, a person who never made waves, never caused trouble. The irony was suffocating. Every day he walked through the doors of that warehouse, he was passing people who would have recoiled in horror if they knew the truth about the little girl in the woods. The team began to gather trash, stealthily collecting coffee cups, cigarette butts, and discarded gum to confirm the DNA match. It was a high-stakes game of shadows, a cat-and-mouse hunt played out in the cold light of day. As the physical evidence began to mirror the genetic findings, the atmosphere in the precinct shifted from cautious optimism to a focused, razor-sharp intensity. They were preparing for the final act, the moment of confrontation that would end the longest, coldest story in the town's history. Every piece of the puzzle, the sweater, the timeline, the ancestral matches, the covertly obtained biological samples, was aligning with terrifying accuracy. The detective sat in a conference room, the walls plastered with photos of the victim, her face still bright with the promise of a life that was ripped away. They weren't just looking at evidence anymore. They were looking at justice, a concept that had felt like a fairy tale for 40 years. The air in the room felt ionized, charged with the collective weight of thousands of people who had prayed for this moment, who had kept the porch lights on, who had held their children a little closer because they knew there was a wolf in the woods. The suspect, unaware of the tightening noose, continued his daily routine, seemingly oblivious to the fact that his history was being reconstructed layer by layer in a precinct just a few miles away. He had built a life on a foundation of silence, a house of cards that was about to be obliterated by the cold, hard logic of modern forensics. The detectives knew that once they made their move, there would be no turning back. The case would move from the quiet halls of investigation to the public glare of the courtroom, where the story would finally be told in its entirety, where the truth would be forced out of the darkness and into the unforgiving light. They checked their equipment, they reviewed the warrant, and they sat in silence, waiting for the signal, waiting for the moment when the last piece of the puzzle would be placed, when the silence of 40 years would be broken by the clatter of handcuffs and the final, definitive resolution of the Miller cold case. The narrative of the suspect's life had been a masterpiece of concealment, but the evidence was about to expose the cracks in the armor. It wasn't just the DNA, it was the way he had lived his life, a constant, low-level performance of innocence that was now being scrutinized through the lens of a killer's profile. They looked at his travel patterns, his employment history, and his social interactions, finding hidden anomalies that were previously invisible. It was like looking at a painting that had been hanging upside down for decades. Once you flipped it, the picture became disturbingly clear. He had been there, at the site of the abduction, on that specific day in 1986. He had been lying about his whereabouts, a lie he had nurtured and fed for 4 decades, a lie that had become his only identity. The evidence was overwhelming, a tidal wave of facts that were about to crash down on a man who had long ago forgotten the details of his own crime, but whose biology had never forgiven him. As the team moved toward the endgame, they were acutely aware of the ghosts they were carrying with them. Every detective, every forensic analyst, and every officer involved in this case felt the presence of the victim. They were her voice now. They were the ones who would finally speak for the girl who couldn't come home. The gravity of this mission, the sheer, crushing weight of it, was enough to make even the most seasoned veteran shudder. They were not just solving a case. They were correcting the historical record, ensuring that a tragedy that had defined a generation would not end in apathy, but in truth. The final preparations were underway, the strategy was set, and the target was in their sights. The cycle of fear, of uncertainty, and of lingering pain was drawing to a close, and in its place, the cold, sharp reality of justice was about to take hold, changing the trajectory of the community forever. In the final hours before the arrest, the tension reached an absolute fever pitch. The surveillance teams were in position, the warrant was ready to be served, and the psychological weight of the moment felt like it was pressing down on the entire county. The suspect was at home, sleeping, entirely unaware that the world he had constructed, the life he had carefully curated to hide his past, was about to vanish. The detectives felt a strange mixture of adrenaline and revulsion. They had spent months getting to know the man, tracing his steps, analyzing his habits, and trying to understand the depravity that had driven him to act in 1986. They were ready to bring him in, ready to stop the charade, and ready to give the family of the victim the one thing they had been denied for 4 decades, the truth. As the sun began to rise over the horizon, casting long, sharp shadows across the street, the team gave the signal. The wait was over. The cold case was about to be broken open, and the silence of 40 years was finally about to shatter into a million jagged pieces, leaving nothing behind but the undeniable, searing heat of the truth. The morning of the arrest didn't arrive with a fanfare of sirens. It arrived with a suffocating, unnatural stillness, the kind that precedes an earthquake. The tactical team had been staged since 3 a.m., parked 3 blocks away, their breath visible in the biting, early morning chill. Inside the house, the suspect, a man who had successfully masqueraded as a pillar of the community for 4 decades, was likely still asleep, his dreams undisturbed by the ghosts that had been pacing the halls of the precinct for years. Every detective on the task force felt the heavy, pulsating rhythm of their own hearts. This wasn't just a tactical entry, it was the final, inevitable collision between a long-buried past and the cold, unyielding present. They had the warrant, they had the genetic confirmation, and they had the moral authority of a grieving community that had been holding its breath for 40 years. As the signal was given, The silence broke with the synchronized, rhythmic thud of boots hitting pavement, a sound that would eventually be remembered as the funeral march for the suspect's secret. The breach was surgical, executed with the precision of a group that had rehearsed this moment in their minds 1,000 times. They moved through the foyer, past the framed family photos, the mundane clutter of a life lived in the light of day, entering the master bedroom where the man who had stolen a child's future lay exposed. He was pulled from his bed, disoriented and stripped of his carefully constructed reality, his eyes widening as he realized that the nightmare he had buried under 40 years of normalcy had finally found him. The handcuffs clicked, a sharp, metallic sound that seemed to ring through the entire house, marking the exact second the past caught up to the present. He was silent, not out of innocence, but out of the sheer, paralyzing shock of realizing that his biological footprint had spoken where he had remained silent. They led him out into the morning mist, the neighbors beginning to stir, peering through their curtains, witnessing the moment that would define their town's history, the moment the monster in their midst was finally unmasked. Back at the precinct, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the electric hum of anticipation. The interrogation room was a sterile, unforgiving space, designed to strip away the defenses of even the most hardened criminal. As the suspect was brought in, the detectives didn't see a grandfather. They saw the shadow that had haunted their files for 4 decades. The camera, perched in the corner, recorded every tremor, every shift in his gaze, and every calculated, trembling breath. Detective Miller entered the room, his movements slow and deliberate, placing the folder, the thick, heavy file of the 1986 investigation, on the metal table. The sound of the file hitting the table was the only introduction needed. It was a physical manifestation of everything he had tried to bury, the weight of the girl he had taken, the life he had destroyed, and the 4 decades of justice that had been accumulating like pressure behind a dam. The questioning began, not with an accusation, but with a question about a name he hadn't heard in 40 years. His reaction was a masterclass in controlled desperation. He tried to maintain the facade, to play the role of the confused, aging man, but the forensic evidence was an immovable object. When they laid out the DNA profile, the map of his ancestry, and the timeline of his presence in Oakhaven, the color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a statue of gray clay. He was cornered by his own biology. The detectives pressed, their voices rising, the rhythm of the interrogation turning from a rhythmic inquiry into a relentless, pounding drumbeat of facts. They didn't need a confession. The evidence was already singing. They needed him to look at the photos, to look at the bicycle, to look at the life he had extinguished, and to acknowledge the reality that he had spent half a century trying to erase. His resistance began to crumble when they played the audio, not of a witness, but of the recording of the community vigil held only days after the disappearance in 1986. The sound of the grief, the sobbing, the prayers, the desperate, hollow cries of a community in agony filled the sterile room. It was the sound of his own handiwork. He had been there, somewhere in that crowd, watching the chaos he had sown. Watching the mother clutching a teddy bear, the father staring blankly into the cameras, the entire town vibrating with a pain that he had manufactured. The realization of his own proximity to the tragedy, the fact that he had walked among them while the search was active, seemed to shatter his composure. His breathing became ragged, his shoulders slumped under the weight of the realization that he was no longer an invisible man, but a man defined entirely by the void he had created. The detectives leaned in, their faces inches from his, the pressure building to an unbearable degree. They didn't stop. They walked him through the day, through the woods, through the abduction, detailing the movements they had reconstructed from the evidence. Each detail was a nail in the coffin of his freedom. He tried to speak, his voice a dry, rasping whisper, but the words were hollow, lacking the conviction of his previous life. He was a man experiencing the total annihilation of his identity. He had believed he was a survivor, a man who had gotten away with it, but he was simply a man who had lived in a 40-year prison of his own making, a prison that was now being torn down piece by piece. The intensity of the confrontation was mirrored by the detective's own struggle, They had spent their careers chasing this moment, and now that it was here, it felt less like a victory and more like an exorcism. As the morning wore into the afternoon, the suspect's facade was completely decimated. The man who had been a quiet warehouse worker, a grandfather, and a neighbor was revealed to be a relic of a darker time, a ghost made flesh. He spoke of the fear he had lived with every day, the terror of a knock at the door, the panic at the sight of a police cruiser, the years of looking over his shoulder. He had been suffering, in his own twisted way, a victim of his own inability to move forward. The detectives listened, not with empathy, but with a cold, analytical fascination, recording the descent of a man who had finally reached the end of his tether. They didn't need to offer him leniency. They didn't need to offer him a deal. They simply needed the truth, and for the first time in 4 decades, the truth was the only thing filling the room. The weight of the case seemed to lift, settling onto the shoulders of the investigators, who felt the profound, lingering exhaustion of a job that had taken everything from them. The suspect sat, head bowed, his hands trembling in the cold metal restraints, a man stripped of his secrets. The investigation was not just a police procedure, it was a societal cleansing. The town of Oakhaven, which had been paralyzed by this cold case for 2 generations, was finally about to breathe again. As the detectives walked out of the interrogation room, leaving the suspect alone in the dark, they knew they had done what was once thought impossible. They had bridged the gap between the past and the present, and in doing so, they had brought a sliver of peace to the soul of a community that had lived for 40 years in the shadow of a secret that was never theirs to keep. The impact of the arrest rippled out from the precinct, reaching the families of the victim, the long-retired detectives who had passed on without knowing the answer, and the thousands of people whose lives had been touched by the shadow of the Oakhaven case. The news hit the community like a shockwave, turning the evening into a vigil of its own. Not one of grief, but of catharsis. People gathered on their porches, whispering the name of the man who had been arrested, the name they had known for years but never suspected. It was a realization that would change the way they saw their town, their neighbors, and the nature of the evil that could exist right beside them. The cold case, the phrase that had been a synonym for hopelessness, was now a victory, a testament to the power of persistence and the inexorable reach of science. As night fell, the detectives returned to their desks to file the reports that would finalize the transformation of their cold case into a cold-blooded reality. They were tired, their eyes burning from the screens, their minds heavy with the details they had unearthed, but there was a quiet, steady resolve in their movements. They had closed the book on the Miller case, but they knew that the story would continue, in the courts, in the media, and in the collective memory of the community. They had faced the monster, and they had won, and as they packed up their belongings to return to their families, they felt a sliver of the normalcy that the suspect had destroyed so many years ago. The case was solved, but the truth remained, a permanent fixture in the history of the town. A reminder that the shadows are never deep enough to hide a killer forever, and that eventually, even the coldest case will find its way into the light. The confession, once extracted, acted like a key turning in a long-rusted lock, swinging open doors into a past that the community had been forced to leave boarded up for 40 years. With the suspect now formally charged, the sterile, clinical atmosphere of the interrogation room dissolved into the chaotic, high-stakes urgency of trial preparation. Every statement the killer had uttered during those grueling hours of admission was being cross-referenced against the physical reality of the 1986 crime scene. The investigators, having shifted their focus from the hunt to the prosecution, spent their days inside the war room, a space plastered with timelines, aerial maps of the woods where the child had been found, and the cold, unyielding forensic reports. They were not merely piecing together a case. They were crafting a narrative for a jury, translating the raw, jagged edges of a 40-year-old trauma into a coherent, undeniable timeline of guilt. The psychological profile of the suspect emerged as the centerpiece of this preparation. It was a study in profound, chilling dissociation. Throughout his life in the decades following the abduction, he had lived as a chameleon, adopting the habits of a quiet, unassuming citizen to blend into the social fabric of his new neighborhood. Yet, Buried deep beneath this layers of performative normalcy, the detectives discovered an obsession with the crime itself. They uncovered, through a search of his home, a hidden cache of newspaper clippings, every article from the local press, every follow-up story on the anniversary of the disappearance, and every cold case update that had appeared in the national media. He had been a collector of his own depravity. He had kept the memory alive, feeding on the community's sorrow, using the unresolved nature of the case as a secret, dark fuel for his own internal existence. This discovery changed the tone of the investigation entirely. It was no longer a crime of impulse, but a crime of ego. As the prosecutors dove into the archives, they encountered the ghosts of retired detectives, men and women who had spent their entire careers haunted by the Miller case. One by one, these investigators were brought back into the fold, not to work the case, but to provide the emotional and historical weight of the ordeal. Their testimonies were not just about evidence, they were about the human cost of the mystery. They recounted the nights spent canvassing door to door, the false leads that sent them chasing shadows across the state, and the slow, grinding erosion of hope that had defined their careers. When they spoke of the night the child disappeared, the room was silent. They remembered the rain, the desperate searchlights cutting through the darkness, and the hollow, echoing grief of the parents. By bringing these voices into the courtroom prep, the prosecution was building more than a legal argument. They were constructing a monument to a truth that had been denied for far too long. The legal team focused intensely on the forensic bridge between the past and the present. The DNA evidence was the linchpin, but they needed to explain, in layperson's terms, why the 1986 technology failed and why the 2026 science was absolute. They brought in geneticists and forensic scientists to simplify the complex, high-level data into a language that a jury could understand, the language of inheritance, of ancestral patterns, and of the unique, individualizing nature of the genetic code. They used digital renderings to show how the skin cells on the sweater matched the suspect, creating a visual bridge that rendered the suspect's previous denials obsolete. This was the era of the CSI effect, where jurors expected high-definition, unassailable proof, and the prosecution was ready to provide it. The evidence was not just a collection of samples. It was a digital trail that led from the killer's hands to the victim's clothing with the precision of a laser. Simultaneously, the community of Oakhaven began to process the news in its own way. The cold case label, which had once been a source of despair, was transformed into a symbol of resilience. Local town halls, once venues for questions about why the case remained unsolved, became places for victims' rights advocates and survivors of similar crimes to share their stories. The stigma of the case, the feeling that the town was cursed, began to fade, replaced by a collective sense of closure. However, this healing was far from uniform. Some families who had lived in fear for years found that the arrest didn't immediately erase the trauma, it merely gave it a name. The suspect's identity became a focal point for the town's anger. The news that he had lived among them, that he had perhaps even shared coffee with the families of his victim, created a visceral, sickening realization that evil was not a stranger, but an acquaintance. In the midst of this emotional turbulence, the defense team began their attempts to chip away at the prosecution's case. They focused on the reliability of the forensic evidence, questioning the chain of custody of the sweater over 4 decades. They argued that the long interval had created a risk of contamination, a technical defense aimed at casting doubt on the sanctity of the DNA findings. The lead investigator, Detective Miller, watched this with a cold, calculated disdain. He knew the integrity of the evidence. He had been there when the freezer was opened, when the sealed bags were handled, and he knew that the lab's protocols were ironclad. But he also understood the danger of the courtroom, the way a skilled attorney could turn a minor, irrelevant detail into a mountain of doubt. He prepared his team for every possible line of questioning, ensuring that when the time came, the science would be the shield that protected the truth. The atmosphere in the county, as the trial date approached, reached a fever pitch. Media outlets from across the country descended on the town, transforming the quiet community into a nexus of national interest. The story of the 40-year cold case was a sensation, a perfect, tragic narrative of a child lost and a truth found. Cameras were set up outside the courthouse, satellite trucks lined the streets, and the town's residents found themselves navigating a circus of curiosity. Yet, despite the chaos, the focus remained on the singular tragedy of the Miller girl. The media attention served a dual purpose. It amplified the tragedy, but it also ensured that the trial would be conducted under the most intense scrutiny. There would be no backdoor deals, no hidden agendas, and no chance for the truth to be buried again. Inside the detention facility, the suspect waited. His isolation had become a metaphor for his life, a solitary, detached existence where the only reality was the impending reckoning. He had ceased to be a functioning member of society and had become an object of study, a specimen of human error and cruelty. The guards reported that he sat for hours in silence, staring at the walls, perhaps replaying the events of 1986 in his mind, or perhaps waiting for a salvation that he knew would never come. His lawyers were his only contact with the outside world, and their reports were grim. The evidence was overwhelming, and the path to a conviction was becoming clearer by the day. He was a man who had outlived his secret, and he was now being forced to confront the consequences of the man he had been in the prime of his life. The prosecution continued to tighten their case, adding layer upon layer of corroborating evidence. They found, through deep background checks, that the suspect had been fired from a job in 1987 for an incident involving a young girl, an event he had managed to keep off his records by moving to a different state. This wasn't admissible as proof of the 1986 crime, but it was essential in creating a pattern, a psychological map that would help the jury understand the suspect's nature. They interviewed old friends, former coworkers, and neighbors, weaving a tapestry of a life built on subtle, yet persistent, patterns of boundary pushing. The picture that emerged was not that of a sudden, freak occurrence, but of a man who had lived in the orbit of his own violent desires for years, a reality that only intensified the tragedy of the child he had stolen. As the weeks leading up to the trial became days, the sense of inevitability grew. The town, once defined by its silence, was now filled with the hum of preparation, of anticipation, and of a strange, tentative hope. The Miller family, who had survived the loss by channeling their grief into activism and advocacy, began to prepare for the final, grueling ordeal of the trial. They were the center of gravity in this unfolding story, the ones who had suffered the most and who stood to gain the least from a verdict, yet they were the ones driving the process forward. Their presence in the courtroom would be the ultimate weight, the reminder of why this cold case was so much more than a collection of forensic data. It was about a life that was taken, a promise that was broken, and the long, arduous journey toward a justice that was finally within reach. The stage was set, the evidence was assembled, and the town stood on the precipice of the final chapter, waiting for the gavel to strike and the truth to finally and permanently take its place in the history of the world. The confession, once extracted, acted like a key turning in a long-rusted lock, swinging open doors into a past that the community had been forced to leave boarded up for 40 years. With the suspect now formally charged, the sterile, clinical atmosphere of the interrogation room dissolved into the chaotic, high-stakes urgency of trial preparation. Every statement the killer had uttered during those grueling hours of admission was being cross-referenced against the physical reality of the 1986 crime scene. The investigators, having shifted their focus from the hunt to the prosecution, spent their days inside the war room, a space plastered with timelines, aerial maps of the woods where the child had been found, and the cold, unyielding forensic reports. They were not merely piecing together a case. They were crafting a narrative for a jury, translating the raw, jagged edges of a 40-year-old trauma into a coherent, undeniable timeline of guilt. The psychological profile of the suspect emerged as the centerpiece of this preparation. It was a study in profound, chilling dissociation. Throughout his life in the decades following the abduction, he had lived as a chameleon, adopting the habits of a quiet, unassuming citizen to blend into the social fabric of his new neighborhood. Yet, buried deep beneath this layers of performative normalcy, the detectives discovered an obsession with the crime itself. They uncovered, through a search of his home, a hidden cache of newspaper clippings, Every article from the local press, every follow-up story on the anniversary of the disappearance, and every cold case update that had appeared in the national media. He had been a collector of his own depravity. He had kept the memory alive, feeding on the community's sorrow, using the unresolved nature of the case as a secret, dark fuel for his own internal existence. This discovery changed the tone of the investigation entirely. It was no longer a crime of impulse, but a crime of ego. As the prosecutors dove into the archives, they encountered the ghosts of retired detectives, men and women who had spent their entire careers haunted by the Miller case. One by one, these investigators were brought back into the fold, not to work the case, but to provide the emotional and historical weight of the ordeal. Their testimonies were not just about evidence, they were about the human cost of the mystery. They recounted the nights spent canvassing door to door, the false leads that sent them chasing shadows across the state, and the slow, grinding erosion of hope that had defined their careers. When they spoke of the night the child disappeared, the room was silent. They remembered the rain, the desperate searchlights cutting through the darkness, and the hollow, echoing grief of the parents. By bringing these voices into the courtroom prep, the prosecution was building more than a legal argument. They were constructing a monument to a truth that had been denied for far too long. The legal team focused intensely on the forensic bridge between the past and the present. The DNA evidence was the linchpin, but they needed to explain, in layperson's terms, why the 1986 technology failed and why the 2026 science was absolute. They brought in geneticists and forensic scientists to simplify the complex, high-level data into a language that a jury could understand, the language of inheritance, of ancestral patterns, and of the unique, individualizing nature of the genetic code. They used digital renderings to show how the skin cells on the sweater matched the suspect, creating a visual bridge that rendered the suspect's previous denials obsolete. This was the era of the CSI effect, where jurors expected high-definition, unassailable proof, and the prosecution was ready to provide it. The evidence was not just a collection of samples. It was a digital trail that led from the killer's hands to the victim's clothing with the precision of a laser. Simultaneously, the community of Oakhaven began to process the news in its own way. The cold case label, which had once been a source of despair, was transformed into a symbol of resilience. Local town halls, once venues for questions about why the case remained unsolved, became places for victims' rights advocates and survivors of similar crimes to share their stories. The stigma of the case, the feeling that the town was cursed, began to fade, replaced by a collective sense of closure. However, this healing was far from uniform. Some families who had lived in fear for years found that the arrest didn't immediately erase the trauma, it merely gave it a name. The suspect's identity became a focal point for the town's anger. The news that he had lived among them, that he had perhaps even shared coffee with the families of his victim, created a visceral, sickening realization that evil was not a stranger, but an acquaintance. In the midst of this emotional turbulence, the defense team began their attempts to chip away at the prosecution's case. They focused on the reliability of the forensic evidence, questioning the chain of custody of the sweater over 4 decades. They argued that the long interval had created a risk of contamination, a technical defense aimed at casting doubt on the sanctity of the DNA findings. The lead investigator, Detective Miller, watched this with a cold, calculated disdain. He knew the integrity of the evidence. He had been there when the freezer was opened, when the sealed bags were handled, and he knew that the lab's protocols were ironclad. But he also understood the danger of the courtroom, the way a skilled attorney could turn a minor, irrelevant detail into a mountain of doubt. He prepared his team for every possible line of questioning, ensuring that when the time came, the science would be the shield that protected the truth. The atmosphere in the county, as the trial date approached, reached a fever pitch. Media outlets from across the country descended on the town, transforming the quiet community into a nexus of national interest. The story of the 40-year cold case was a sensation, a perfect, tragic narrative of a child lost and a truth found. Cameras were set up outside the courthouse, satellite trucks lined the streets, and the town's residents found themselves navigating a circus of curiosity. Yet, despite the chaos, the focus remained on the singular tragedy of the Miller girl. The media attention served a dual purpose. It amplified the tragedy, but it also ensured that the trial would be conducted under the most intense scrutiny. There would be no backdoor deals, no hidden agendas, and no chance for the truth to be buried again. Inside the detention facility, the suspect waited. His isolation had become a metaphor for his life, a solitary, detached existence where the only reality was the impending reckoning. He had ceased to be a functioning member of society and had become an object of study, a specimen of human error and cruelty. The guards reported that he sat for hours in silence, staring at the walls, perhaps replaying the events of 1986 in his mind, or perhaps waiting for a salvation that he knew would never come. His lawyers were his only contact with the outside world, and their reports were grim. The evidence was overwhelming, and the path to a conviction was becoming clearer by the day. He was a man who had outlived his secret, and he was now being forced to confront the consequences of the man he had been in the prime of his life. The prosecution continued to tighten their case, adding layer upon layer of corroborating evidence. They found, through deep background checks, that the suspect had been fired from a job in 1987 for an incident involving a young girl, an event he had managed to keep off his records by moving to a different state. This wasn't admissible as proof of the 1986 crime, but it was essential in creating a pattern, a psychological map that would help the jury understand the suspect's nature. They interviewed old friends, former coworkers, and neighbors, weaving a tapestry of a life built on subtle, yet persistent, patterns of boundary pushing. The picture that emerged was not that of a sudden, freak occurrence, but of a man who had lived in the orbit of his own violent desires for years, a reality that only intensified the tragedy of the child he had stolen. As the weeks leading up to the trial became days, the sense of inevitability grew. The town, once defined by its silence, was now filled with the hum of preparation, of anticipation, and of a strange, tentative hope. The Miller family, who had survived the loss by channeling their grief into activism and advocacy, began to prepare for the final, grueling ordeal of the trial. They were the center of gravity in this unfolding story, the ones who had suffered the most and who stood to gain the least from a verdict, yet they were the ones driving the process forward. Their presence in the courtroom would be the ultimate weight, the reminder of why this cold case was so much more than a collection of forensic data. It was about a life that was taken, a promise that was broken, and the long, arduous journey toward a justice that was finally within reach. The stage was set, the evidence was assembled, and the town stood on the precipice of the final chapter, waiting for the gavel to strike and the truth to finally and permanently take its place in the history of the world. The courthouse doors opened at dawn, but the queue of people waiting to secure a seat in the gallery had begun forming the night before, under the cold glow of streetlights that cut through the Oakhaven fog. It was a crowd of quiet, determined faces, some who had carried this tragedy in their bones since childhood, and others who had only known the Miller name as a warning whispered by their parents to keep them from playing too close to the woods. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick, heavy with the sterile scent of polished wood and industrial disinfectant, a physical space designed to strip away the emotion of a tragedy and reduce it to the cold, analytical language of the law. Yet, no amount of institutional coldness could mask the electric charge in the room. This was the moment 40 years in the making, the state of Oregon versus the ghost of 1986. When the bailiff called the court to order, the silence that fell over the room was absolute, a collective holding of breath that felt like the entire county was suspended in a vacuum. The defense table was occupied by the suspect and his two court-appointed attorneys. He sat there, wearing a neutral, gray suit that seemed slightly too large for his shrinking frame, his hands folded neatly in front of him. To a casual observer, he looked like a retired accountant, a man whose worst offense might have been a minor tax discrepancy. But to those who knew the file, who had seen the photographs of the bicycle in the brush, he was a living monument to deception. Across the aisle, the prosecution team sat in sharp contrast, focused, surrounded by stacks of black binders, their screens glowing with the digitized blueprints of a crime scene that had outlasted the original detectives who first drew them. The opening statements began not with a dramatic flourish, but with a simple, devastating recitation of the facts. The prosecutor, a woman whose voice carried a quiet, resonant authority, stood before the jury box and painted a picture of Oakhaven in the fall of 1986. She described the smell of the damp pine needles, the sound of the school bus dropping children off at the corner, and the routine safety of a town that believed its boundaries were sacred. She walked the jury through the timeline of that fateful Tuesday afternoon, the minute-by-minute countdown to an abduction that took less than 60 seconds to execute but had lingering consequences that spanned 4 decades. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The simplicity of her narrative was its strength, a direct line of sight from a little girl's last ride to the man sitting just 30 feet away. When it was the defense's turn, they immediately went on the attack, targeting the very foundation of the prosecution's case, the passage of time. The lead defense attorney stood before the jury, his tone conversational, almost apologetic, but underneath it lay a sharp, calculated skepticism. He spoke of the fragility of memory, the degradation of evidence, and the inherent danger of relying on technology that did not exist when the crime was committed. He argued that 40 years of storage, of handling by dozens of hands, of shifting protocols and changing laboratory standards had contaminated the evidence beyond repair. Science is a powerful tool, he told the jury, but it is only as reliable as the hands that hold it. And for 40 years, those hands have changed, the boxes have moved, and the truth has been muddied. It was a classic strategy of reasonable doubt, an attempt to make the jury fear that they might convict an innocent man based on a technical glitch. The first witness called to the stand was the retired officer who had been the first to arrive at the scene in 1986. His hair was now white, his posture slightly stooped, but his voice was steady as he recounted the details of that evening. He spoke of the fading light, the desperate calls of the search parties, and the moment he found the blue bicycle lying in the ditch. The prosecution projected a photograph of the bicycle onto the large screen in the courtroom. It was a visceral, jarring image, the bright blue frame contrasting sharply with the dark, wet leaves of the ditch. The witness pointed to the front wheel, remembering how it was still spinning slowly when he first walked up, a detail that had haunted his dreams for 40 years. The defense cross-examined him gently, respectful of his age and service, but pushed hard on the lack of immediate forensic preservation in 1986, forcing him to admit that the scene had been walked over by dozens of volunteers before it was fully secured. As the trial progressed into its second day, the focus shifted from the emotional memory of the crime to the cold, objective reality of the forensic laboratory. The prosecution called the lead forensic geneticist who had handled the DNA sweep. She was a young woman, highly precise, who spoke with the calm assurance of someone whose work is rooted in the fundamental laws of nature. She explained the concept of touch DNA, how the simple act of grabbing a piece of fabric leaves behind microscopic skin cells that contain a complete genetic blueprint. She showed the jury how they had targeted the collar and cuffs of the victim's sweater, extracting genetic material that had been protected from the elements within the tightly woven fibers of the wool. Using clear, high-definition graphics, she demonstrated how the DNA profile extracted from the sweater matched the suspect's profile with a statistical certainty of 1 in several billion. The defense attempted to shake her, suggesting that the DNA could have been transferred via casual contact or secondary exposure, but she stood her ground, explaining that the concentration of the genetic material in those specific areas was consistent with a violent struggle, not a random, passive transfer. The jury watched her, many of them leaning forward, their faces reflecting the realization that the science was not just an opinion, it was an absolute, mathematical proof. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew increasingly tense as the state began to introduce the suspect's own actions in the days following the crime. The prosecution called a former co-worker of the suspect, an elderly man who had traveled from Arizona, to testify. He spoke of the suspect's sudden decision to quit his job and leave the state just 3 weeks after the disappearance. He didn't give 2 weeks' notice, the witness recalled. He just didn't show up one Monday. When I called him, he said he had family business elsewhere and wasn't coming back. It was strange because he had just bought a house. This sudden flight, framed by the prosecution as evidence of a guilty mind, was a key piece of circumstantial evidence that bridged the gap between the forensic profile and the human behavior of the killer. The defense tried to downplay the significance of the move, presenting records that showed the suspect had been looking for work in other states prior to 1986. But the timing was difficult to ignore. The prosecution lined up the dates on a massive digital timeline on the wall: the disappearance, the discovery of the sweater, the first media reports naming a suspect vehicle, and, finally, the suspect's sudden departure. The alignment of these events was like watching a series of falling dominoes, each one pushing the suspect closer and closer to the center of the conspiracy. The weight of the evidence was accumulating, a heavy, silent pressure that seemed to physicalize in the room, making the air feel thick and hard to breathe. As the week drew to a close, the prosecution prepared to introduce the most devastating piece of evidence: the items recovered during the search of the suspect's home. The courtroom was silent as a detective took the stand, carrying a sealed plastic bag containing a small, tarnished metal object. It was a child's charm, a silver heart that had been listed in the original 1986 report as an item the victim was wearing on her necklace the day she disappeared. The detective explained how they found it hidden inside a hollowed-out book in the suspect's attic, wrapped in a faded piece of cloth. The revelation was a physical blow to the gallery. A gasp went through the room, followed by the quiet, muffled sound of sobbing. It was the physical connection, the trophy of a predator who had kept a piece of his victim close to him for 40 years, a silent testament to his ongoing obsession. The defense attorney sat frozen, his face pale as he looked at the silver heart on the screen. There was no technical explanation for how this item, uniquely identified by a small scratch on the back that matched descriptions given by the victim's mother in 1986, could have ended up in his client's possession. The suspect himself stared down at the table, his eyes vacant, his hands clenching and unclenching as the realization of his exposure settled over him. The house of cards he had built, the 40 years of quiet suburban life, was completely demolished in a single afternoon. The truth had not just caught up with him, it had crushed him under the weight of his own secrets, leaving him exposed to the world as the monster he had always been. The discovery of the silver heart turned the courtroom into an emotional pressure cooker, but the trial had to grind forward, moving from the horror of the physical trophy to the clinical coldness of the psychological battleground. On the sixth day of the proceedings, the prosecution called Dr. Eris Thorne, a forensic psychologist who had spent decades analyzing the behavioral patterns of serial predators and offenders who successfully blend into society. The room was deathly quiet as she took the stand, her voice low, measured, and academic, stripping away any lingering sense of mystery to expose the raw, mechanical pathology of the man sitting at the defense table. She explained to the jury the concept of compartmentalization, the terrifying psychological ability of an individual to separate their darkest, most destructive impulses from their daily, public-facing persona. For 40 years, this man did not live in fear of getting caught, Dr. Thorne testified, her eyes locked onto the jury. He lived in a state of supreme confidence. The collection of newspaper clippings and the retention of the silver heart were not signs of remorse or anxiety. They were trophies of control. To him, every news broadcast about the cold case was a private validation of his own perceived superiority. He watched the community mourn, he watched the family grieve, and he felt a profound sense of power because he held the key to their torment. The defense objected fiercely, arguing that Dr. Thorne was speculating on the mental state of the accused without a formal, voluntary psychiatric evaluation, but the judge overruled. The jury took notes in a rapid, rhythmic scratching of pens, their faces hardened by the realization that the old man before them was not a victim of time, but a master of psychological evasion. The defense team knew they were drowning. In a desperate bid to regain control of the narrative, they called their own expert, a veteran private investigator and former federal agent named Richard Vance. Vance's testimony was designed to cast doubt on the physical integrity of the Oak Haven Police Department's evidence storage facilities during the late 1980s and early 1990s. He presented historical logs showing that the precinct had suffered a minor basement flood in 1993 and that several boxes of evidence had been moved to a temporary, non-climate controlled warehouse during a facility renovation in 1998. We are talking about a critical chain of custody that was broken not once, but multiple times, Vance declared, pointing to a slide of the old warehouse. In an environment like that, cross-contamination is not just a possibility, it is a statistical probability. Damp air, shared storage space, and unregulated handling mean that DNA from an entirely unrelated case could easily have migrated to the fabric of that sweater. But the prosecution was prepared for this defense. During cross-examination, the lead prosecutor did not raise her voice. She simply presented the laboratory's modern extraction logs. She forced Vance to admit that the touch DNA recovered from the sweater's collar and cuffs was not a surface-level contaminant that had drifted through the air of a damp warehouse. It was deeply embedded, friction-transferred skin cells ground into the wool fibers under immense physical pressure, the kind of pressure that only occurs during a violent physical struggle. "Mr. Vance," the prosecutor asked, her voice cutting through the silence of the room like a scalpel, "can a flood in 1993 ground skin cells so deeply into wool that they mimic the exact friction patterns of a manual abduction?" Vance paused, his jaw tightening, before giving a quiet, reluctant, "No." The defense's primary shield of contamination had been systematically shattered. With the technical defenses failing, the trial entered its most agonizing phase, the testimony of the survivors. The prosecution called Elizabeth Miller, the mother of the victim, who is now 81 years old. She walked to the stand with a slow, frail dignity, assisted by her surviving son. The silence in the gallery was so absolute that the rustle of her silk scarf sounded like dry leaves scraping across concrete. She did not look at the suspect. She kept her eyes fixed on the prosecutor and the jury. When asked to describe the afternoon of the disappearance, she spoke with a clarity that 40 years of grief had failed to dim. She described the exact shade of the sky, the warmth of the autumn sun, and the last words she said to her daughter. "Don't be late for dinner." "I spent 40 years looking out the front window," Elizabeth said, her voice trembling but unbroken. "Every time a car slowed down, every time the phone rang in the middle of the night, every time a new detective was assigned to the case, I thought, this is the day." The worst part of a cold case is not the lack of answers. It is the presence of hope. It is a cruel, relentless hope that tears at you every single morning. You learn to live with the grief, but the uncertainty is a poison that never leaves your system. As she spoke, several jurors openly wept, wiping their eyes with tissues, their gaze shifting from the frail mother to the cold, motionless figure of the suspect. The emotional gravity of the room had shifted entirely, pulling everyone into the deep, dark well of a family's half-century of suffering. The defense declined to cross-examine Elizabeth Miller, recognizing that any attempt to question her memory or her pain would be viewed by the jury as an act of monstrous insensitivity. Instead, they waited for the state to rest its case, preparing for their final, high-risk gamble. On the 9th day of the trial, the courtroom was stunned when the lead defense attorney stood and announced that the suspect would take the stand in his own defense. A murmur ran through the gallery like static electricity. It was an incredibly risky move, often born of desperation, but it was the only card they had left to play. They needed the jury to see a human being, not a forensic profile. They needed him to speak, to project an image of a confused, fragile old man who was being railroaded by modern technology he couldn't comprehend. The suspect slowly made his way to the witness stand, his movements deliberate, his breathing shallow. For the first time, the jury heard his voice, a low, raspy gravel that seemed to carry the weight of his hidden years. Under direct examination by his attorney, he painted a picture of a quiet, simple life. He spoke of his childhood, his decades of hard labor in warehouses, his love for gardening, and his quiet retirement. He denied ever seeing the victim, denied ever being in the woods near Oak Haven on that Tuesday in 1986, and claimed he had no idea how the child's silver heart had ended up in his attic. "I bought that book at a garage sale in the 90s, he muttered, his hands trembling on the wooden railing of the stand. "I never even opened it. I didn't know there was anything inside. I am a peaceful man. I have never hurt anyone in my life." It was a practiced performance of elder vulnerability, but the illusion was short-lived. The prosecutor stepped up for the cross-examination, her demeanor shifting from professional distance to a sharp, predatory focus. She did not start with the night of the murder. She started with his lies. She produced employment records, housing applications, and tax documents from the late 80s, showing a pattern of systematic identity manipulation. She showed how he had used 3 different social security numbers, lived under 2 aliases, and moved 7 times in the 5 years following the crime. "If you were a peaceful man with nothing to hide," she asked, stepping closer to the stand, "why did you spend the decade after 1986 living like a fugitive? Why did you discard your own name?" The suspect stammered, his fragile persona beginning to crack under the pressure. I had financial troubles," he whispered, his eyes darting toward his defense team, who sat in grim silence. "I owed money. I wanted a fresh start." "A fresh start," the prosecutor repeated, her tone dripping with ice. "Or did you want to put as much distance as possible between yourself and the blue bicycle in the ditch?" She walked over to the evidence table and picked up the plastic bag containing the silver heart. She held it up, just inches from his face, the metal catching the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. "You say you bought a book at a garage sale, and by some miraculous coincidence, that book contained the exact, unique, scratched silver heart worn by a girl who disappeared from the very town you fled. Do you expect this jury to believe that?" The suspect's composure vanished. The trembling in his hands turned into a violent shudder. His eyes locked onto the silver heart, and for a split second, the facade of the gentle grandfather slipped away, revealing a glimpse of the cold, calculated predator beneath. His jaw clenched, his eyes narrowed, and a sudden, sharp silence fell over the room as he stared at the piece of metal that had finally sealed his doom. "I don't remember," he hissed, his voice losing its fragile rasp and turning hard, flat, and empty. It was the exact tone of a man who knew the game was over, a man who had finally been dragged out of the shadows and forced to look at the wreckage of his own design. The prosecution had delivered the final, devastating blow. The cross-examination ended not with a dramatic confession, but with the quiet, chilling revelation of the suspect's true nature. As he was led back to the defense table, the air in the courtroom felt lighter, as if the massive, crushing weight of the 40-year secret had finally been lifted from the shoulders of the community. The trial was drawing to its inevitable conclusion. The arguments had been made, the evidence had been laid bare, and the jury was about to be sent into the deliberation room to decide the fate of a man who had spent his entire adult life running from a truth that had finally caught him. The silence of 40 years was over. The countdown to the final verdict had begun. The courtroom doors swung shut behind the jury as they retired to deliberate, leaving an immediate, heavy quiet in their wake. For 40 years, the weight of the Miller case had been carried by an entire community. Now, that crushing burden was concentrated in a small, locked room where 12 citizens sat around a table, tasked with translating decades of grief and complex forensic science into a single, irreversible word. In the gallery, nobody left their seats. The air was thick with the residue of the trial's final, suffocating moments, the image of the suspect staring at the silver heart, his raspy voice turning cold and flat, still hung in the courtroom like gun smoke. The Miller family sat in the front row, their shoulders touching, a human wall of endurance, waiting for the final stroke of the clock. At the defense table, the suspect sat motionless, staring at his hands. He was no longer the grandfatherly figure his lawyers had tried to present. The cross-examination had stripped that illusion away, leaving only the hollowed-out frame of a man who had outlived his own lies. His defense attorneys whispered quietly to one another, their faces grim as they reviewed their notes. They knew that the contamination defense had fallen flat under the precise, physical reality of the friction-embedded DNA on the sweater. They knew that the silver heart, found wrapped in a cloth inside a hollowed-out book in their client's attic, was an evidentiary anchor dragging him down into a dark, inescapable reality. The courtroom was suspended in a state of hypervigilance, where every creak of a wooden bench or rustle of a file folder sounded like a gunshot. Outside the courthouse, the media circus continued to pulse, but inside, the atmosphere was solemn, almost sacred. Detective Miller paced the hallway, his boots clicking rhythmically against a polished terrazzo floor. He had spent his youth chasing the shadow, and now, as an older man, he was on the precipice of seeing that shadow finally take a physical, permanent shape behind bars. He stopped the window, looking out over Oakhaven. He thought about the original investigators, the men who had retired without ever getting this closure, the ones who had passed away, with the files still sitting on their bedside tables. This verdict was not just for the living. It was a reckoning for the dead, a restoration of balance to a town that had been tilted on its axis for nearly half a century. 2 hours passed, then 3. The deliberation was not expected to be quick, not because the evidence was weak, but because the responsibility was immense. To convict a man of a 40-year-old crime based on modern genetic technology required the jury to carefully weigh every piece of the technical puzzle. They had to review the extraction logs, understand the genetic markers, and reconcile the fragile, fading memories of 1986 with the absolute, mathematical certainty of the DNA sweep. Every minute that passed felt like an eternity to those waiting in the courtroom. Elizabeth Miller sat with her eyes closed, her fingers moving slowly over a small bead in her pocket, her breathing slow and steady. She had waited 14,000 days. She could wait a few more hours. Suddenly, at 3:30 p.m., a sharp, double knock echoed from the jury room door. The sound was electric, causing everyone in the gallery to sit up straight in unison. The bailiff stepped forward, opening the door, and took a folded slip of paper from the foreperson. He marched it over to the judge's clerk, who handed it to the judge. The judge, a man who had presided over hundreds of trials, but whose face remained an unreadable mask of judicial decorum, put on his reading glasses and looked down at the paper. He nodded slowly, then looked up at the courtroom. "The jury has reached a verdict," he announced, his voice echoing in the silent room. "Please bring the defendant to the bar." The suspect was helped to his feet by his attorney. He stood with his head slightly bowed, his hands clasped in front of him, showing no visible emotion. The jury filed back into the box, their faces solemn, none of them looking at the defense table, a traditional, chilling sign that the verdict was not in the defendant's favor. The foreperson, a middle-aged schoolteacher who had taken meticulous notes throughout the 2-week trial, stood up as the judge asked for the decision. On the charge of first-degree murder, the foreperson read, her voice shaking slightly but gathering strength as she spoke, "We find the defendant guilty." A collective gasp swept through the gallery, followed immediately by a wave of quiet, muffled weeping. It was not a sound of anger, but of a profound, overwhelming release of tension. The dam had broken. The 40-year wait was gone, shattered by a single word spoken in the quiet of a Tuesday afternoon. Elizabeth Miller did not scream or cry. She simply let out a long, slow breath, her head bowing slightly as her son wrapped his arms around her. The suspect remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the empty space in front of him, his expression flat, as if he had already accepted his fate decades before he was ever caught. The judge thanked the jury for their service, his words carrying a weight that extended far beyond the walls of a courtroom. "This case has haunted this county for 40 years, the judge said, looking directly at the suspect. "You believed that the passage of time was your shield. You believed that by living a quiet life, by changing your name, and by burying your secrets, you could escape the consequences of your monstrous actions. But science, memory, and the unyielding determination of this community have proven you wrong. You will spend the remainder of your natural life behind the walls of a state penitentiary, where the memory of what you did will be your only companion." As the handcuffs were placed back on his wrists, the metal clinked with a final, definitive authority. The suspect was let out through the side door, disappearing from the public eye for the last time. The courtroom began to empty, but the people of Oakhaven did not scatter. They gathered on the courthouse steps, under the gray, damp Oregon sky, talking in quiet, hushed tones. The cold case was no longer a symbol of unresolved horror. It was a testament to the fact that no secret is safe from the truth, that time does not erase guilt, and that eventually, even the deepest shadows are forced to yield to the light. The story of the Miller girl was finally over, and for the first time in 40 years, the town of Oakhaven could sleep in peace. The echo of the gavel had faded, but the silence that settled over Oakhaven was of a different quality now. It was not the suffocating, anxious quiet of a town hiding a monster, but the deep, exhausted stillness of a battlefield after the dust had settled. The trial was over. The verdict was written into the permanent record, but for those who had lived in the orbit of the tragedy, the true work of reconstruction was only just beginning. A cold case does not simply vanish when the handcuffs click. It leaves behind a hollowed-out crater in the collective psyche of a community, a space where 40 years of suspicion, fear, and grief had hardened into something structural. In the days following the sentencing, the forensic task force did not immediately disband. The war room at the precinct remained intact for a final week, its walls still plastered with the physical remnants of the 40-year hunt. Detective Miller sat at his desk, surrounded by cardboard boxes labeled for long-term archival storage. His fingers traced the edge of a yellowed notebook from 1986, the handwriting of a long-dead detective detailing the initial, fruitless searches along the timberline. The physical files would soon be moved to the basement archive once again, but this time they would bear a red stamp across their covers, closed by arrest and conviction. It was a small piece of bureaucratic ink, yet it represented the culmination of a lifetime of professional obsession. The focus of the investigators now shifted to the chilling task of retroactive tracing. A man who could commit such a calculated act of violence in 1986 and then blend seamlessly into society for 4 decades rarely exists in a vacuum. The forensic genetic genealogy team began running the suspect's DNA profile through national databases, checking for connections to other unsolved abductions and homicides across the Pacific Northwest and beyond. They looked at his residency timeline, the sudden moves, the brief employments under assumed names, the gaps in his history, overlaying his geographic path with maps of unresolved cold cases from the late 80s and 90s. Every precinct he had ever lived near was contacted, forcing detectives thousands of miles away to pull their own dusty files from storage, wondering if the Oakhaven killer was the phantom they had been chasing in their own jurisdictions. This secondary phase of the investigation revealed the terrifying reality of the suspect's existence. He had lived like a virus, dormant for long stretches, yet leaving a subtle, highly destructive footprint wherever he stayed. The team discovered a series of unresolved prowling complaints and suspicious incidents in 2 neighboring states that matched the exact window of his residency in the early 90s. Although the statute of limitations had run out on those lesser offenses, they painted a disturbing picture of a lifelong predator who had spent decades testing boundaries, refining his methods of evasion, and constantly monitoring the periphery of communities for vulnerability. The realization that he had likely continued to stalk the edges of other lives while Oakhaven slept in ignorance added a layer of retrospective terror to his decades of freedom. For the Miller family, the transition from active grieving to a state of resolution was not a sudden pivot, but a slow, disorienting adjustment. Elizabeth Miller spent the week after the trial in her home, the phone ringing continuously with calls from media outlets, old friends, and strangers offering their support. She declined most of them, choosing instead to sit on her porch, looking out at the yard where her daughter had once played. The presence of the blue bicycle, which had been returned to the family after its release from the evidence locker, stood in the hallway, a physical artifact of a life cut short, now stripped of its status as a piece of forensic proof and restored to its identity as a child's toy. The family began the quiet, private process of planning a proper memorial, one that would focus not on the horror of how her life ended, but on the beauty of the 9 years she had lived. The town of Oakhaven itself was undergoing a quiet transformation. The woods that bordered the eastern edge of the community, once viewed as a dark, threatening boundary where a child had vanished, began to lose their menacing quality. The local park board proposed dedicating a small portion of the woodland trail as a memorial garden, a space filled with native wildflowers and a simple stone marker bearing her name. It was an effort to reclaim the physical landscape of the town, to strip the environment of the trauma that had defined it for 2 generations. Parents who had spent their entire lives keeping their children on a tight leash, haunted by the warnings of their own parents, began to let their kids play outside a little longer as the autumn afternoons faded into twilight. Yet, the scars of the 40-year mystery were not so easily erased. The local library held a community forum where residents, psychologists, and historians gathered to discuss the collective trauma of the cold case. They spoke about the bystander guilt that had lingered in the town, the agonizing, self-inflicted questions of neighbors who wondered if they had seen something that afternoon in 1986 but failed to report it, or if they had shared a casual conversation with the killer during his brief stay in the area before his flight. The dialogue was raw, emotional, and necessary, a process of public exorcism that allowed the community to finally verbalize the silent suspicion that had eroded their trust in one another for nearly half a century. As the weeks turned into months, the media presence finally dwindled, leaving Oakhaven to return to its quiet, suburban routine. The satellite trucks departed, the reporters packed up their microphones, and the national spotlight shifted to the next sensational headline. But the lessons of the Miller case remained embedded in the local culture. The precinct's cold case unit, which had once been an underfunded, neglected corner of the department, received a permanent increase in resources, ensuring that other forgotten files would not be left to gather dust indefinitely. The success of the DNA sweep had proven that time is not a defense against justice, and that the modern tools of science have the power to reach back into the darkest corners of history to demand accountability. The suspect, now inmate number 867-5309 at the state penitentiary, began his life sentence in relative obscurity. He was placed in a maximum security unit, away from the general population, a reflection of both the nature of his crime and the risk his high-profile conviction posed to his safety inside the walls. The guards reported that he maintained a silent, detached demeanor, refusing interviews with criminologists who sought to understand his psychological makeup, and spending his days staring at the concrete walls of his cell. He had lived 40 years in a prison of his own deception. His physical confinement was simply the formalization of a life already defined by isolation and fear of exposure. The final chapter of the Oakhaven cold case was not written in a courtroom, but in the quiet moments of closure that occurred throughout the town. It was found in the soft sigh of a mother who could finally stop searching every face in a crowd for her daughter's killer. It was found in the steady, untroubled sleep of a detective who had finally closed his most haunting file, and it was found in the rustle of the wind through the pines of the new memorial garden, where the name of a 9-year-old girl was finally associated with peace, rather than mystery. The silence of 40 years had been shattered, and in its place, the town of Oakhaven had finally found its voice, its strength, and its redemption. The winter of 2026 descended upon Oakhaven with a heavy, biting frost that turned the gravel roads into sheets of black ice and stripped the towering Douglas firs down to their dark, skeletal frames. For the first time in 40 years, the freezing fog that rolled off the Oregon hills did not carry the phantom weight of an unsolved horror. The town was adjusting to a new gravity, one where the names of the past had finally been anchored to a definitive truth. But inside the walls of the state's forensic archive, located in a windowless, temperature-controlled facility 60 miles north of the precinct, the ripples of the Miller breakthrough were triggering a quiet, systemic revolution. The DNA sweep that had shattered the 40-year-old silence was no longer viewed as an isolated miracle. It had become the blueprint for a massive, statewide excavation of forgotten history. We are talking about a physical and digital sweep of unprecedented scale. The success of the Oakhaven case had forced the state legislature to approve emergency funding for what was officially designated as the Ancestral Justice Initiative. Across the Pacific Northwest, thousands of cardboard boxes, manila envelopes, and vacuum-sealed plastic bags containing evidence from cold cases dating back to the late 1960s were being pulled from their dark shelves. The air in these archive rooms was thick with the scent of old paper, decaying adhesive, and the clinical tang of chemical preservatives. Technicians wearing double-layered nitrile gloves and protective face shields worked under the glare of high-intensity ultraviolet lights, scanning fabrics, swab kits, and personal effects that had been handled by a generation of detectives who had long since passed away. The methodology developed during the Oak Haven investigation was now being applied with industrial efficiency. No longer did investigators have to rely on traditional, narrow search parameters. The modern lab was a production line of genetic reconstruction. The process began with high-throughput sequencing, where advanced sequencers reconstructed fragmented, highly degraded strands of DNA that had been exposed to moisture, heat, and decades of suboptimal storage. Once a viable profile was generated, it was handed over to a specialized team of investigative genetic genealogists, highly trained analysts who worked like digital cartographers, mapping out the vast, interconnected networks of public family trees to find the exact intersection where a killer's identity was hidden. The atmosphere inside these forensic suites was a contrast of sterile technology and raw human drama. Every time a new genetic profile was uploaded to the genealogical databases, a quiet tension filled the room. The analysts sat before rows of monitors, watching the algorithms calculate centimorgan values, the unit of measurement used to determine the biological distance between two individuals. A match of 50 centimorgans could mean a third cousin. A match of 200 could point to a first cousin once removed. Each numeric shift on the screen was a step closer to resolving a tragedy that had paralyzed a family decades ago. It was a digital dragnet, quiet and invisible, yet far more relentless than any physical police search in history. As the initiative gathered momentum, the psychological profile of the Oak Haven killer was being studied by criminal behavioral analysts at the federal level. They wanted to understand how a man could commit such a monstrous act and then successfully switch off his predatory instincts to live a mundane, law-abiding life. The records showed that the suspect had not merely avoided police contact. He had actively constructed a psychological fortress, convincing himself that his past was a fiction, a bad dream that belonged to someone else. Criminologists refer to this as extreme adaptive compartmentalization, the ability to lock away a violent, dark identity so deeply that the individual's daily, conscious mind experiences no guilt, no anxiety, and no fear of exposure. This defense mechanism was so effective that when the suspect was first arrested, his confusion had not been entirely performed. He had lived in his lie for so long that the truth felt like an intrusion, an error in the system. But the forensic evidence had demolished that fortress, proving that while the human mind can lie to itself, biology does not participate in the delusion. The cells he left on the wool sweater in 1986 were an indelible chemical record of his actions, a biological signature that no amount of psychological compartmentalization could erase. The study of his behavioral patterns was now being used to train a new generation of profilers, helping them identify the subtle, low-key anomalies in suspect behavior that had previously been dismissed as harmless eccentricities. Meanwhile, in Oak Haven, the physical landscape was slowly catching up to the emotional resolution of the case. The construction of the memorial garden on the edge of the woods had begun, despite the frozen ground. Local volunteers, including retired officers who had worked the original investigation, gathered on weekends to clear the brush, lay out the gravel pathways, and plant the winter-hardy shrubs that would bloom in the spring. It was a collective act of labor, a physical purging of the land that had been associated with horror for 40 years. The space was being transformed from a place of avoidance into a sanctuary of remembrance, a place where people could sit with their memories without the shadow of the unknown hanging over them. Elizabeth Miller visited the site often, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, watching the progress from a wooden bench nearby. She was a woman who had spent half her life in a state of suspended animation, her thoughts constantly looping back to that autumn afternoon in 1986. Now, her face bore the quiet, settled expression of someone who had survived a long, exhausting journey. She no longer had to look at every stranger in the supermarket with a subconscious, agonizing suspicion. The monster had a name, a face, and a prison cell. The unresolved questions that had eaten away at her peace had been replaced by a quiet, steady certainty. The justice she had received was not a cure for her grief, but it was a shield against the torment of the unknown. The impact of the case was also felt in the local school district, where safety protocols that had been established in the paranoid wake of the 1986 disappearance were being reevaluated. For 2 generations, Children in Oak Haven had been raised under a regime of hypervigilance, their outdoor play restricted, their movements constantly monitored by anxious parents who remembered the little girl who never came home. While modern parental instincts remained protective, the thick, toxic atmosphere of generalized fear began to lift. The realization that the danger was not an omnipresent, mythical phantom lurking in every shadow, but a specific, flesh-and-blood individual who is now neutralized, allowed the community to breathe a collective sigh of relief. As the winter deepened, the state's cold case task force announced the resolution of 3 additional cold cases: a 1991 homicide in Portland, a 1994 disappearance in Eugene, and a 1989 assault in Salem, all solved using the exact genetic genealogy protocols developed during the Miller investigation. The news was met with a sober, reflective satisfaction across the state. The DNA sweep had transitioned from a high-tech experiment into a standard, indispensable tool of modern law enforcement. It sent a clear, unyielding message to those who believed they had outrun their crimes. The clock was ticking, the science was advancing, and the past was no longer a safe place to hide. The detectives who had worked the Oak Haven case were invited to speak at law enforcement conferences across the country, sharing their technical strategies and organizational methods with other departments eager to replicate their success. Detective Miller, who had postponed his retirement to see the trial through to its conclusion, spent his final days at the precinct organizing his digital files and preparing to hand over the reins to a younger successor. He felt a profound, lingering fatigue, but it was a healthy tiredness, the kind that comes after a long, hard-fought victory. He had kept his promise to the family, he had honored the memory of the victim, and he had proved that the passage of time is nothing compared to the unyielding determination of those who seek the truth. In the final weeks of the year, the state penitentiary where the suspect was serving his life sentence released a brief, routine update. The inmate had been integrated into the facility's specialized housing unit, where his daily routines were strictly regulated for his own protection. He remained silent, refusing all visitors, including his legal team, and spending his hours in the small, concrete recreation yard, staring up at the gray Oregon sky through the heavy steel mesh. He was a man who had traded 40 years of unearned freedom for a lifetime of absolute confinement, a living reminder that the accounts of justice are eventually settled, no matter how long the ledger remains open. As the year drew to a close, a quiet ceremony was held at the Oak Haven Memorial Garden. Under a canopy of towering pines, with the cold winter wind rustling through the branches, a small group of family, friends, and investigators gathered to dedicate the space. A simple, polished granite marker had been placed at the center of the garden, bearing the name of the 9-year-old girl and the years of her brief, precious life. There were no long speeches, no dramatic declarations, only a moment of silent reflection, the quiet burning of candles against the gathering dusk, and the deep, enduring peace of a community that had finally brought its lost child home. The silence of 40 years had been broken, not by violence, but by the quiet, unstoppable force of the truth. The spring of 2027 arrived in Oak Haven not with a sudden burst of warmth, but with a gradual, stubborn thawing of the earth, as if the soil itself was slowly recovering from a long, frozen sleep. The rain, which had fallen in relentless, gray sheets throughout the winter, subsided into a soft, misting drizzle that clung to the needles of the Douglas firs and washed the dust of 40 years from the streets. For the first time in nearly half a century, the community did not feel the heavy, invisible constriction of the unresolved. The trial was over, the verdict was sealed, and the forensic sweeps had moved on to other forgotten corners of the state. Yet, inside the brick walls of the Oak Haven Historical Archive, a different kind of excavation was taking place, one that aimed to document the anatomy of the 40-year silence, ensuring that the lessons of the Miller case would never be lost to time. A local historian, working in collaboration with the retired investigators who had kept the flame alive, had begun the monumental task of compiling an oral history of the case. They were not looking for the sensational headlines or the dramatic courtroom confrontations that had filled the national news broadcasts. Instead, they were searching for the quiet, human undertones of the tragedy, The way the disappearance had altered the daily choices of ordinary people, the subtle erosion of neighborly trust, and the quiet, agonizing resilience of those who refused to let the memory of a 9-year-old girl fade into an administrative footnote. They spent hours sitting in wood-paneled living rooms, recording the voices of elderly residents whose memories of that Tuesday afternoon in 1986 remained as sharp and painful as broken glass. These recordings revealed a complex, deeply moving portrait of a town that had spent decades living in a state of low-grade, perpetual shock. "You have to understand," one retired schoolteacher recalled, her voice a fragile whisper on the tape, "before that day, we didn't lock our doors. We didn't watch our children walk the 3 blocks to the park. The town was our playground, and we believed the forest was our protector. But when the blue bicycle was found in that ditch, the forest became a wall, a barrier that kept the danger in and the safety out. We spent the next 40 years looking at our neighbors through a lens of quiet suspicion, wondering if the hand we shook at the grocery store was the hand that had torn our community apart." This psychological scar tissue was precisely what the Ancestral Justice Initiative was uncovering in other parts of the region as well. The state's genetic genealogy program had expanded, creating a specialized unit dedicated entirely to analyzing the systemic impact of long-term unsolved crimes on small, isolated communities. They found that a cold case is not a static event. It is a living, breathing entity that continues to shape the behavior, the politics, and the mental health of a town for generations. By solving these cases, the investigators were doing more than just putting predators behind bars. They were performing a kind of historical surgery, removing the dead, toxic tissue of the unknown so that the community could finally begin to heal. At the state laboratory, the technological momentum generated by the Oakhaven breakthrough showed no signs of slowing down. Forensic scientists were now experimenting with even more advanced techniques, including phenotyping, using DNA samples to reconstruct the exact physical appearance, facial structure, and ancestry of unidentified suspects. This meant that even in cases where no direct genetic match could be found in public databases, investigators could generate highly accurate, digital portraits of the perpetrators as they would have appeared at the time of the crime. The implications were revolutionary, turning every discarded piece of physical evidence into a potential photograph of a killer, a development that made the past feel closer, more transparent, and infinitely more dangerous for those who had escaped justice. In the midst of this technical evolution, Detective Miller, now officially retired, found himself adjusting to a quiet, unfamiliar rhythm of life. His office at the precinct had been cleared, the cardboard boxes of files replaced by the sleek, digital monitors of his successor. He spent his mornings walking along the river, his mind finally free from the relentless, looping timelines of the 1986 investigation. Yet, the connection to the case remained. He spent his afternoons volunteering at the Oakhaven Memorial Garden, working alongside the volunteers to maintain the gravel pathways and ensure the native wildflowers were protected from the late spring frosts. He had spent his career chasing a shadow. Now, in the quiet of his retirement, he was content to cultivate the light. The suspect's legal journey, however, had not entirely reached its end. In late spring, his defense team filed a formal appeal, challenging the admissibility of the genetic genealogy data used to identify him. They argued that the use of public DNA databases without explicit, individual consent constituted an unconstitutional invasion of privacy, a violation of the Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable search and seizure. The appeal was viewed by legal scholars as a landmark test case, one that had the potential to define the legal boundaries of forensic technology for decades to come. The debate played out in law journals and editorial pages across the nation, pitting the absolute right to privacy against the collective societal demand for justice and accountability. But in Oakhaven, the academic debates felt distant and irrelevant. The truth had already been spoken, and no amount of legal maneuvering could alter the physical reality of the evidence that had been laid bare in the courtroom. The silver heart, the friction-embedded skin cells on the sweater, and the suspect's own devastating collapse on the witness stand had created a consensus of guilt that was immune to technical appeals. The town had moved past the need for legal validation. They had seen the monster, they had heard his voice, and they had watched him be led away in chains. The verdict was not just a legal decision, it was a moral certainty that had settled deep into the bones of the community. Elizabeth Miller remained the quiet center of this resolution. She had declined to attend the appeal hearings, choosing instead to focus her remaining energy on her family and the memorial garden that had become her sanctuary. On a warm afternoon in May, she sat on her favorite bench in the garden, watching a group of local children play near the edge of the path. The laughter of the children, bright and untroubled, filled the space that had once been defined by a suffocating silence. She looked down at the granite marker, her hand reaching out to touch the cold, polished stone. The name of her daughter was no longer a symbol of unresolved horror, but a beacon of enduring love, a reminder that even the deepest, darkest winter must eventually yield to the promise of spring. The final days of the historical archiving project were marked by a quiet, reflective gathering at the local library. The oral histories had been completed, the tapes digitized and placed in a permanent collection accessible to the public. The project's coordinator stood before a small crowd of residents, including several retired officers and members of the Miller family, to present the completed work. "This archive is not a monument to a crime," she told the quiet room. "It is a monument to the survival of a community. It is a record of how we held onto our humanity, our hope, and our love for one another during 40 years of darkness. We have proven that the truth is not something that can be buried, and that the memory of those we have lost is a force that no amount of time can ever diminish." As the evening sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the library courtyard, the people of Oakhaven walked out into the warm, quiet air. The town was still the same place of tall pines and misty hills, but the atmosphere had changed completely. The silence of 40 years was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant peace that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. The case was solved, the record was complete, and the memory of the little girl who had vanished on an autumn afternoon was finally, and permanently, safe in the light of day. The appeal hung in the legal ether for months, a technical ghost rattling the chains of a closed door, but the highest court in the state did not waver. When the final ruling was handed down on a crisp autumn morning, the justices affirmed the conviction without hesitation. The written opinion was a resounding validation of the forensic future, declaring that the public has no expectation of privacy in abandoned genetic material and that the search for justice must not be blinded by the passage of years. With that final legal avenue collapsed, the last remaining threads of uncertainty were severed. The system had spoken, the science had stood its ground, and the perpetrator was left with nothing but the cold, concrete reality of a life sentence without the possibility of parole. The file was not just closed, it was welded shut. In the late afternoon of that same day, Detective Miller walked into the Oakhaven precinct one last time. He wasn't there to look at files or consult with the active roster. He had come to return a physical key to the desk sergeant, a symbolic relinquishing of his ties to the active machinery of the law. As he walked through the quiet hallways, past the digital dispatch screens and the modern forensic workstations, he realized that the air inside the building felt different. The invisible mold of the cold case, the heavy, damp smell of unresolved failure that had clung to the corners of the precinct for 4 decades, was entirely gone. The modern department was moving forward, energized by the success of the DNA sweep, using the Oakhaven blueprint to dismantle other historical brick walls across the state. They were no longer afraid of the dark. They knew they had the tools to illuminate it. He drove out to the memorial garden as the sun began its slow, golden descent behind the ridge of Douglas firs. The garden had matured over the year, the native shrubs taking deep root in the soil, their leaves turning a brilliant, fiery orange in the autumn air. It was a space that had successfully rewritten its own geography. The woods no longer felt like a boundary line of terror, a place where a child's life had been swallowed by a shadow. Instead, the garden had become a living room for the community, a place where people came to sit, to think, and to remember that the worst things do not always get the last word. Miller stood by the polished granite marker, looking at the simple engraving of her name. He felt a quiet, profound sense of completion, a realization that his life's work had not been in vain, and that the promise he had made to a grieving mother 40 years ago had been fully, unconditionally kept. Elizabeth Miller joined him a few minutes later, her steps slow but deliberate, supported by her son. She did not look tired anymore. The deep, etched lines of anxiety that had defined her face for 40 years had softened into the gentle creases of age. They stood together in silence for a long time, watching the wind rustle through the pines, the light filtering through the canopy in long, dusty shafts of amber. There were no words left to say. The trial had exhausted the language of grief, the forensic reports had exhausted the language of science, and the verdict had exhausted the language of justice. What remained was the quiet, enduring presence of memory, a memory that was no longer haunted by the image of a blue bicycle in a ditch, but comforted by the knowledge that the truth had finally prevailed. As the twilight began to gather, casting deep purple shadows across the valley, a small, rhythmic sound broke the silence of the garden. It was the soft, steady clicking of a bicycle chain in the distance, a sound that would have caused every heart in Oakhaven to stop in terror just a few years prior. But as the rider, a young girl from the neighborhood, passed by the entrance of the garden, her laughter trailing behind her like a bright ribbon in the cold air, nobody flinched. The fear had lost its grip. The monster had been stripped of his mystery, his power, and his freedom, leaving behind a community that had reclaimed its safety, its trust, and its future. The story of the 1986 Oakhaven cold case was finally complete. It had begun with a sudden, devastating silence on a rainy autumn afternoon, a silence that had stretched across 40 years, paralyzing a family and casting a long, dark shadow over an entire generation. But the truth is a patient, stubborn thing. It does not decay, it does not dissolve, and it does not forget. Through the quiet dedication of those who refuse to let the memory die and the unyielding precision of modern science, the silence had been broken, the shadow had been dispelled, and the accounts of justice had been settled in full. As the last light of the day faded from the Oregon sky, the memorial garden was swallowed by a peaceful, untroubled darkness, a darkness that no longer held any secrets, only the deep, eternal rest of a child who had finally been brought home. The transition of the Oakhaven case from a raw, agonizing wound into a historical anchor marked the final, quiet realignment of the town's identity. By the winter of 2027, the regional headlines had moved on to newer, fresher crises, but within the walls of the local schoolhouse, the community library, and the living rooms of Oakhaven, the changes were permanent, structural, and quiet. The trauma had lost its heat. What remained was the cold, hard geology of truth. Yet, for those who had lived through the 40-year vacuum, the resolution brought a strange, disorienting peace, a phenomenon that sociologists and behavioral therapists who visited the town began to call post-resolution vertigo. It was the sensation of standing on solid ground after half a life spent balancing on the edge of a crumbling cliff. In the academic halls of the State University, researchers began compiling a comprehensive study on the long-term societal effects of the Ancestral Justice Initiative. They utilized the Oakhaven case as their primary control subject, charting how the sudden introduction of forensic certainty affects a population that has adapted to decades of chronic suspicion. The data revealed a dramatic, measurable drop in local anxiety indices, a stabilization of property values near the eastern forest border, and an unprecedented surge in community volunteerism. The removal of the anonymous threat had functioned like the extraction of a deep-seated splinter. The physical tissue of the town was finally closing over the void, regenerating with a quiet, healthy resilience that had been absent since the autumn of 1986. The state's forensic archives had also settled into a highly disciplined, automated rhythm. The trial of the Oakhaven killer had established a legal and operational standard that was now being adopted by jurisdictions across the country. The Oakhaven Protocol, as it was formally designated in law enforcement manuals, dictated the exact methods for preserving, extracting, and genealogical mapping of degraded biological evidence from cases older than 25 years. It was a legacy built on the tragic loss of a single child, a standard that ensured no future cold case would ever have to wait 40 years for the technology to catch up to the crime. The sterile, cold rooms of the state lab were no longer places of stagnant hope. They were active engines of historical rectification, where the past was systematically held accountable to the present. For the active detectives at the precinct, the Oakhaven case had become a textbook example of procedural persistence. The new lead investigator, a sharp, tech-savvy detective who had taken over Miller's desk, kept a single, framed copy of the original 1986 search grid on her wall. It wasn't there as a reminder of failure, but as a monument to the evolution of the craft. She knew that the high-definition screens, the algorithms, and the genetic databases at her disposal were only as effective as the human determination driving them. Every week, she met with her team to review the remaining unresolved files in their jurisdiction, applying the same relentless, systematic scrutiny that had eventually unmasked the grandfatherly predator of Oakhaven. The department had learned that time is not an enemy to be feared, but a distance to be traveled with steady, unyielding steps. Elizabeth Miller's life had quieted down to a peaceful, domestic routine that was no longer interrupted by the sudden, terrifying ringing of the telephone in the middle of the night. She spent her days tending to the small garden in her backyard, her movements slow but deliberate, her mind finally free from the agonizing loop of the what-ifs. On weekends, her son and his children would visit, their laughter filling the house that had stood silent and guarded for so many years. The children would run through the yard, their movements watched not with the frantic, clawing terror of the past, but with the calm, protective warmth of a grandmother who knew the wolf had been removed from the woods. The family had survived the longest winter of their lives, and they had emerged into a quiet, permanent spring. On a cold, clear afternoon in November 2027, Detective Miller walked down the main street of Oakhaven, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his heavy wool coat. He stopped at the local diner, a place where the wood panel walls were still decorated with historical photographs of the town's early logging days. He ordered a coffee and sat by the window, watching the logging trucks rumble past, their massive tires kicking up the damp, pine-scented mist from the asphalt. A few of the older residents recognized him, offering a quiet, respectful nod of acknowledgement as they passed his table. There were no dramatic expressions of gratitude, no speeches, and no fanfare. The town's appreciation was expressed in the most valuable currency they possessed, the return of normalcy, the freedom to live their lives without the burden of the unknown. He looked out toward the eastern horizon, where the dark, jagged line of the forest met the pale, winter sky. The woods were quiet now, their secrets fully surrendered to the light. The blue bicycle was no longer an exhibit in a courtroom or a phantom in a detective's dream. It was a memory of a child's joy, a symbol of a life that had been loved, lost, and finally vindicated. The 40-year silence was not just broken, it was replaced by the steady, untroubled rhythm of a community that had found its peace, its justice, and its closure. As Miller stood up, left his cup on the table, and walked out into the crisp, clean air, he knew that the journey was truly finished. The past had been reconciled, the records were complete, and the town of Oakhaven was finally and beautifully quiet. The snows of December 2027 blanketed the valleys of Oregon in a quiet, uniform white, burying the raw earth of the Oakhaven Memorial Garden under a thick, protective layer of frost. Inside the county courthouse, the physical records of the Miller trial had finally been bound, digitized, and moved to the deep storage vaults, their journey through the legal system officially complete. Yet, the true legacy of this 40-year journey was not found in the archives, but in the widening ripples of institutional change that continued to spread outward from this small timber town. The Oakhaven breakthrough was no longer a localized event. It had become the catalyst for a fundamental rewriting of how society views its obligations to the forgotten victims of the past. Across the United States, the success of the Ancestral Justice Initiative was being watched by legislators, civil rights advocates, and law enforcement agencies alike. The legal precedent set by the state's Supreme Court, affirming that abandoned genetic material carries no expectation of privacy when used to resolve violent crimes, became the bedrock for new federal guidelines. This wasn't merely a victory for prosecutors, it was a profound shift in the balance of power between the predatory and the vulnerable. For decades, The passage of time had acted as an unofficial statute of limitations for the most clever or fortunate offenders. Now that shield was gone. The message vibrating through every prison yard, every quiet suburban neighborhood, and every cold case unit was clear. The past is no longer a safe harbor, and your own biology is a witness that never dies. In the academic world, the Oakhaven effect became a subject of intense study. Criminologists and sociologists published papers analyzing the unique psychological relief that occurs when a community's longest-running mystery is resolved. They noted that the collective anxiety of a town does not simply evaporate, it is replaced by a profound, reflective stillness. In Oakhaven, the local clinic reported a significant decrease in prescriptions for sleep aids and anxiety medications among the generation that had grown up in the shadow of 1986. The physical health of the community was directly tied to its moral resolution. The extraction of the unknown threat had allowed the social fabric of the town to heal, knit together by a shared experience of justice that had once seemed completely impossible. Inside the state laboratory, the technicians who had performed the original DNA sweep were now training teams from neighboring states. The facility had been expanded, its budget permanently secured by a public that recognized the profound moral value of the work. Under the high-intensity lights of the new sequencing wing, analysts worked with a quiet, reverent focus. They knew that every degraded sweater, every stained piece of cardboard, and every microscopic slide of biological evidence they handled was a potential key to a family's liberation. They were the modern cartographers of justice, mapping the complex, microscopic trails left by those who believed they had walked away clean. For Detective Miller, the winter brought a deep, physical contentment that he had not experienced in his entire adult life. He no longer woke up in the dark hours of the morning with his mind racing through the timelines of 1986, trying to find the one connection he had missed. His retirement was no longer a retreat from an unfinished battle. It was a peaceful transition into the quiet rhythms of a life well lived. He spent his days in his workshop, the smell of cedar shavings and oil replacing the sterile scent of precinct coffee and old files. Yet, he remained a quiet guardian of the memory. Once a week, he would walk to the memorial garden, clearing the fresh snow from the granite marker, ensuring that the name of the little girl who had changed everything remained visible to the world. Elizabeth Miller sat in her warm living room, the quiet hum of the heater the only sound in the house. She looked out the window at the snow-covered street where her daughter had once ridden her bicycle. The house, which had felt like a fortress of grief for 40 years, now felt like a sanctuary of peace. She had lived to see the truth spoken in a court of law. She had lived to see the man who had stolen her future led away in chains, and she had lived to see her community reclaim its innocence. The grief of her loss would never truly leave her, but the toxic, corrosive burn of the unknown had been replaced by a soft, enduring grace. She was a mother who had brought her child home, not in the way she had prayed for in 1986, but in the only way that time and justice would allow. The final chapter of this long, historic struggle was not written in the cold ink of a legal document, nor was it defined by the high-tech machinery of a forensic laboratory. It was written in the quiet, ordinary choices of the people of Oakhaven. It was found in the parents who let their children build snowmen in the park without the clutching terror of the past. It was found in the retired officers who could finally look at their own children without the phantom of failure clouding their eyes. And it was found in the soft, steady light of the candles that burned in the memorial garden as the winter night closed in. The 40-year cold case was resolved. The shadows had been completely dispelled, and the town of Oakhaven was finally and forever at peace. As the winter of 2027 gave way to the sharp, clear air of early 2028, the physical and emotional landscape of Oakhaven settled into a state of permanent grace. The snow on the foothills began to melt, feeding the creeks that ran through the deep timberland where the search parties had once labored in vain. But the water that rushed over the smooth river stones no longer carried the heavy, suffocating secrets of the past. The transformation was complete. What had begun as a desperate, agonizing search for answers on a cold autumn afternoon in 1986 had evolved into a historical milestone of justice, forever changing the way the world approached the forgotten victims of violence. The state's Ancestral Justice Initiative, which had used the Oakhaven DNA sweep as its foundational blueprint, had now expanded into a fully integrated regional network. The Oakhaven Protocol was officially codified into federal law enforcement training programs, ensuring that the techniques developed to solve the Miller case, combining high-throughput genetic sequencing with advanced genealogical triangulation, were taught to detectives in every major precinct across the country. The legacy of the 9-year-old girl was no longer defined by her tragic absence, but by the systemic light her case had cast into the darkest, most neglected corners of American criminal justice. Over 70 cold cases across 5 states had already been resolved using the very same protocols, bringing a quiet, long overdue peace to thousands of families who had lived for decades in the suffocating dark. In the quiet heart of Oakhaven, the local historical society completed the final installation of the permanent archive. Housed in the newly renovated wing of the community library, the exhibit did not focus on the lurid details of the crime or the sensational aspects of the trial. Instead, it was designed as an interactive testament to the power of community resilience. It contained the oral histories of the searchers, the early hand-drawn maps of the search grids, the local newspaper editorials demanding justice, and the modern scientific reports that had ultimately broken the 40-year silence. It was a space designed to teach future generations that the moral arc of their town did not bend toward apathy, but toward an unyielding, persistent demand for the truth. Detective Miller, walking through the quiet library wing on a Tuesday morning, felt the profound, physical weight of his decades-long journey completely dissipate. He looked at the digitized faces of his predecessors on the archive wall, men who had carried the file to their graves, their names etched into the history of the case, but their hands denied the final closure. He felt no anger, no lingering bitterness, only a deep, reverent gratitude that he had been the one destined to stand in the light when the shadow was finally vanquished. His retirement had become a rich, peaceful reality, no longer a retreat from an unfinished battlefield but a quiet, active participation in the healing of the town he had spent his life protecting. For Elizabeth Miller, the arrival of spring was marked by a quiet ceremony in the memorial garden. Surrounded by her family, her surviving son, and the grandchildren who carried the genetic memory of a sister they had never known, she watched the first blooms of the native wildflowers open under the warm Oregon sun. The blue bicycle, long since returned by the state and restored to its original luster, sat quietly in the family's home, no longer a jagged piece of forensic evidence, but a cherished heirloom of a life that was loved, lost, and fiercely defended. Elizabeth stood by the granite marker, her hand resting on the smooth, warm stone. She did not weep. The tears of 40 years had been replaced by the steady, unshakable strength of a mother who had kept her promise, who had run the race to its absolute end, and who had finally brought her child home to rest. The final chapter of the Oakhaven cold case was not written in the cold, clinical pages of a court transcript, nor was it defined by the high-tech sensors of a state laboratory. It was written in the laughter of the children who played untroubled beneath the towering Douglas firs, in the unlocked